Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see people still coming in and joining us this afternoon. It's a real pleasure for my colleagues Petras Austrevicius, Morten, Løkkegaard, and myself, the ALDE group members, combined here to welcome you this afternoon for what is really a hot topic, the question of so-called fake news that we're going to be discussing. And if we didn't know better, we would think that this suddenly sprung up in the age of the internet, maybe with President Donald Trump or the influence of Russia. But actually, when we look back in history, the question of propaganda influencing people's minds is age-old. But maybe because of new political dynamics, because of the increasing role that social media platforms play in allowing us to share information very quickly, we do see it back on the political agendas as a hot topic. And I've been reading a lot about what is dubbed fake news, and I think it's important for us to distinguish between different elements of it. Just because somebody says something that you might find undesirable, it's not reason enough to accuse them of spreading fake news. When there is propaganda being spread, it's an element, but it's not necessarily all to be labeled as fake news. And certainly there are people that may have opinions or write blogs about, different interpretations of the world or medicine or other kinds of elements that may not be something we agree with, but that are not necessarily fake news either. So I've come to a point where I think it's perhaps more relevant to talk about junk news, and to look at the motives as well behind those who are spreading it, whether it's really intended to drive a political agenda, whether it is a journalistic error that can be made, human mistakes also happen, and to really try to drill a bit deeper into what is what, instead of oversimplifying, with the risk of taking measures and accepting measures that could actually stifle freedom of expression, stifle the very open societies, open internet and open debate that we as liberals and hopefully as all Europeans actually want to protect from erosion and attacks and undermining in whichever way. So hopefully today, with the excellent speakers that we have, we can get a bit closer to what is a way to deal with quote-unquote fake news and what is not, what laws we already have in place to deal with the behavior around the spreading of junk news, or what new measures might be useful in order to have a harmonized approach in Europe and to avoid, for example, measures taken in different countries fragmenting our European digital space while we're actually trying to build one. That is the broad outline of the discussion this afternoon. What we're going to do, and this meeting is live streamed, so there's more people participating than just the ones in the room. We're going to have 3 panels zooming in on different aspects. They'll be moderated by my colleagues, so I will leave them to introduce the speakers that will be on their panels. But I'm very happy to start with an introduction to the topic from 2 real experts. We have Lisa Maria Neudert from Oxford University, where she is actually researching at the Computational Propaganda Project. She looks at the nexus of political communication, technology studies, and government. And she's in her doctoral work focusing on the technical, regulatory, and civil society countermeasures to propaganda in the digital space. She's previously researched propaganda, social bots, and fake news, and looked at it in relation to the evolvement of digital media and the whole ecosystem that forms. She studied at Oxford Internet Institute and has attended other universities also as a Fulbright scholar, and is very well positioned to share with us her thoughts. Then, after Lisa Marie speaks, we will hear from David Kay, hopefully someone whose work you follow, because it is worth doing so. He is the UN Special Rapporteur on protection of freedom of speech. He's a professor of law and has done a wide spectrum of work when it comes to encryption, anonymity, as promoters of freedom of expression, the protection of whistleblowers and journalistic sources, and the responsibility of private internet companies. He also used to work at the State Department, looked at the applicability of the Geneva Conventions after 9/11, and he looked at accountability in serious human rights abuses. He's published extensively. His work is wide as well as very comprehensive, and he will share his thoughts, particularly in his role as the now UN Special Rapporteur on Protection of Freedom of Speech. They will kick off, but of course this is your afternoon too. We want this to be interactive. We want you to feel free to ask questions and be part of the discussion. So get ready after our speakers start, and we'll get back to you. And people who are watching the live stream are also free to submit questions through Twitter to us. Thank you, and I would like to give you the floor to start.
Hello, I'm Lisa Maria Neudert. I'm from the Oxford Internet Institute. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for your excellent remarks. You already mentioned that it is on us now to build an open digital space where freedom of opinion can still flourish, and my presentation today is going to introduce some of the threats to that freedom of speech and to that democracy online. I'm going to present today about an issue that the World Economic Forum has labeled one of the top 10 threats to society in 2014. I'm going to present to you. Sorry, is the microphone working?
It's a little bit soft. Yeah.
Wonderful. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So where were we? I'm going to present today about an issue that the World Economic Forum has labeled one of the top 10 threats to society in 2014 already. I'm going to talk about an issue that has impacted elections in the US, in the UK, in France, and is very likely to impact the elections that are upcoming in Germany. I'm going to talk about an issue that directly plays into tendencies of media distrust, about distrust and skepticism about the political establishment, and one that flourishes on social media because the content it produces is so shareable. I'm going to talk today about junk news. First of all, why am I talking about junk news? Already brought up in the introduction, I'm not Donald Trump talking about CNN. I'm a researcher, and the term fake news is simply not usable anymore for research, which is why our project has come up with the definition of junk news. But let's go one step back first and start at the very root of the problem. So when we're talking about junk news, it's very important to understand that we're not just talking about a few Facebook pages that were designed by Macedonian teenagers with a lot of fantasy. But it's actual very sophisticated news pages. It is professional pages that are using multimedia content, that are using modern distribution strategies, modern marketing content strategies. And those kind of strategies, we can label as propaganda. What do we mean by propaganda? Propaganda wants to manipulate. It has an agenda. It wants to influence its users. It wants to influence its readers. And it does so by appealing to the heart, to the emotion, rather than to rationality. But looking into propaganda in the digital age, it has fundamentally changed. Some of you may argue that propaganda has been around for a very long time already. In fact, this here is a picture of Alexander the Great, and he, even 300 years before Christ, was traveling with some sort of PR team that was spreading positive propaganda about him, if you want so. Also, obviously, in both World War I and World War II, propaganda has played a pivotal role in demonizing opponents and also in mobilizing soldiers on the ground. Interesting is also about propaganda that it has a tendency to always go with the media and go with whatever is modern and interesting right now. So when propaganda started, it was really word of mouth. It was sermons, it was chants, it was speeches. And then with print, propaganda gained momentum. That was the first time during the French Revolution when propaganda started using word, it started using leaflets, and it also started using cartoons. And now propaganda has found its way into radio, into TV, and also, as you can see here, this is actually an original Walt Disney Hollywood production. So propaganda always had this tendency of going with the mass media, of going to wherever people are looking for entertainment, for information. And where is that right now? That is just that. That is social media. That is Facebook, that is Twitter, it's Instagram, it is WhatsApp, it is personal messengers. And I think what's very important to stress and to understand about that is that social media is no longer just something that young people use and that millennial people are using, but social media is incredibly widespread. Indeed, in 2017, the Oxford Digital News Report has published that in Europe, somewhat between 30 to 70% of people per country are using social media every week to access news. 80% of people in Europe are using one Facebook product every week. So that is just to emphasize how widespread social media is and how important it is, and also that it's becoming a sort of a new public sphere. It is where people go when they want to form an opinion. It is where they seek their information. It is where they debate. So, but we had that revolution before in propaganda where the channels had changed. Right now, it seems like we simply have a new channel of propaganda, which is social media, which is online. So does the mere change in channel mean that propaganda changes too? And we at our project think yes, it changes, and we think yes, it changes significantly so. And that is what we label as computational propaganda. So let's take a look into what is different about computational propaganda and why I think it's so much more powerful and impactful than previous forms of propaganda. At the very core, you still have the idea of the manipulation of opinion. So you still have the essence of propaganda where there's an agenda that is being pursued, where someone is supposed to be manipulated into believing something. But then the methods are very different. Because computational propaganda is data-driven. That means that agents that are using computational propaganda know a lot about their users. How do they know it? They know that because the way we are using social media. They know that because we are liking content on social media, because we are engaging with other people, because we're leaving traces of our data online everywhere. And that then in turn can be used for targeting. So computational propaganda uses big data to target users and to convince it of its agenda. For these purposes, we're also looking into automation that is behind that. So computational propaganda is using machines, it is using algorithms, it is using social bots, not only in the distribution of its content, but also in the creation of its content. So there's an element of automation, a machine behind it. It's not just humans anymore, which potentially increases the force as well. And then back to the channel again, social media. And what is interesting to understand about social media is that social media has transferred capabilities of content generation to users. So it's very easy for users on social media to make a nice picture, to provide a blog post that, however, still looks sophisticated and looks like professional media content. So we label that as user-generated content, and that is to say that the capabilities of designing that kind of propaganda content have shifted towards the user itself. So now let's take a step back, that we know that what propaganda looks like in theory, what does it actually look like in the field? What is propaganda and junk news like in Europe right now? So for that, I've brought to you a couple of headlines that I've collected over the past few weeks. For example, the New York Times says about junk news, or as it refers to as fake news, Europe combats a new foe of political stability, fake news. Forbes magazine thinks fake news threaten critical elections in Europe. Time magazine is even convinced that Russia has launched a fake news war on Europe. So obviously, all this content is very interesting for us as researchers because it signals that there is a lot going on and that junk news and computational propaganda are perceived to be a big threat to society right now. But we wanted to look into actual evidence of that. So we wanted to, if you want so, fact-check those headlines. And that we did by conducting a big data analysis. We were looking into what information was shared by actual users over social media. we were looking into URLs that were shared during pivotal moments of public life in Europe over the past year. That is to say, during elections. And we're looking into what URLs users were sharing as an indicator for what they were reading. And then we were looking into duration of information and professionally produced news on the one hand, and then junk news on the other hand. And what we found, I think, is quite interesting. We were looking into 4 elections, the US elections, the French elections, and also the UK elections, and the German federal presidency elections, and are currently also analyzing the elections that are upcoming in September now. We have collected a big data sample of 27 million tweets that we have analyzed, and 1 million URLs, so 1 million links to external content such as junk news. And for that, then we're comparing the ratio of information to junk news on the other hand. So the first country that we had a look at was the US, where junk news, where fake news has formed a very heated debate. And we were looking into the elections and specifically into how voters were sharing information in Michigan. And there we found a relation of information to junk news of 1-to-1. So for every single news item that was shared over social media, 1 junk news medium was shared. So it's 50-50 of information that was being shared. And we thought that was quite telling, and we also were honestly quite shocked with that results. So interesting now, how does it extend to Europe, and how is the situation in Europe like, especially as we have this year of super elections coming up? In France, and the UK and in Germany, we found a ratio that was not quite as bad. So for France, we found a relationship of information to junk news of 7-to-1. And for both the UK and for Germany, we found a junk news share of about 20%, which is obviously much lesser than what we found in the US. And which also leads us to the conclusion that we've come up with, is that junk news in Europe are not as big as a problem in the US. They definitely are present, but it's nowhere near as it has been in the US. But then does that mean for us that fake news is not a real problem in Europe, and that we maybe shouldn't regulate it, and that it's a problem that is just very heated in the media, but maybe not so much in real life? I think very differently, and I'm going to tell you why I think that. The first thing I want to point out is that social media has emerged as an online publics. And it's a new public sphere where people are debating their opinion, where they're getting their information, where they are really taking part in political life. But it's important that that is not just happening out in the open. Only until very recently, if you actually wanted to have a stance in the public, if you wanted to convince people of your agenda in the public, you had to do that publicly. But now with social media, you have the opportunity to do that clandestinely, because it actually affords this clandestine sharing of information that is afforded by secret Facebook groups, by private messengers, by private messaging boards. So a lot of the junk news that are being circulated is something that is beyond our control, and also something that we cannot watch as researchers. So it's important to bear in mind that, yes, we do have access to some sort of sample of junk news that are being circulated, but a lot of it is actually not happening in broad daylight. The second point I want to point out is that computational propaganda has afforded the democratization of propaganda. It's no longer just big nation states. It's no longer just big corporate entities with money that can afford to produce professional propaganda. But it's literally anyone. It's Macedonian teenagers who can pump out professional-looking fake news sites. And that is also exactly the key why it's so difficult to make an attribution as to who is responsible for the propaganda that is being shared. Because even, for example, when we're considering organized actors, even those organized actors are way more dispersed in the propaganda that they are producing and they are circulating. For example, when we're thinking about a propaganda campaign, it is not just circulated by one big governmental entity, for example, but it's hundreds and thousands of users and also fake users, of bots on the ground. And I think the third point I want to bring up is overregulation. I think it's very tempting to now think of this as a big problem that can be solved by filtering the internet, by censoring the internet. And there's also tendencies already where social networks have been put into a position where they are in charge of deciding which information is good on the internet and which information is bad. And I think that is a very dangerous position to be in. So I think it is on us, and I think it is also on European politics right now to think about strategies how we can tackle this problem, because it is a problem. It potentially will become a problem that is worse, because social media is not going to go away. Technology is going to get more advanced, and it is getting more advanced any day. So I do think it's very important for us now to think about strategies, how we can educate the public about junk news, how we can debunk fake news, and also strategies how we can make sure that that debunking is actually reaching the users that it targets. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Marietje, for inviting me to be here. Thank you, Lisa Marie, for a really interesting presentation, and a really important one. I want to talk about some of the same issues that Lisa Marie has raised, and maybe put them into a bit of a normative context, in a way picking up from where she left off, focusing on not just the nature of the problem, which I think requires significant thinking, and which I think the introduction that Lisa Maria provided is really important in that respect, but also to give us a little bit of a framework for thinking about what to do in the face of this problem. I do want to start, though, by saying one thing about the moment that we're in, and it's a moment that I think has existed more or less since November, since after, I guess it was November 6th or 8th, that Tuesday in November when Donald Trump was elected, because it was after that moment where, even though researchers, people like Lisa Maria, knew that this was a problem, but where it really captured the public's attention, and it was captured throughout the mainstream media in particular, and I think it generated a bit of a hysteria over the problem, where there's clearly a problem, but the question is really, what do we do about it? And what we do about it cannot just be what the New York Times editorialized last November, which is ensure that the technology companies fix it, because obviously it's a technology problem that can be fixed by technologists, by engineers, by big companies. And while, of course, technology companies are a part of the solution, also a part of the problem, they can't be expected to simply provide some technological fix that solves the fake news or junk news problem. And that's essentially where I want to start, which is, let's try to move away, and perhaps we've moved a little bit away from the hysteria and we now have some space to think about it rationally, although I'm not totally convinced by my own words there. So I want to say a couple of words about the normative framework, a couple of words about the risks of regulation and overregulation, and then highlight some of the points that my colleagues and I, other monitors of freedom of expression in Europe, the inter-American system, and the African system, concluded in a joint declaration that we released in March. So I'll end with some points from that. So the first is the standards. So in terms of fake or junk news, I think it's important to start from the point that our normative framework is rooted in international human rights law or fundamental freedoms under European law. And in particular, I want to focus on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in particular Article 19. So Article 19 is, as is similar in the European Convention on Human Rights, protects everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, and through any media. I mean, one key part of that right is that it's a protection of all information and ideas. It doesn't specify between false ideas and true ideas. So, and maybe this is a problem in our law. I don't think so. But the law doesn't make that distinction. So as we think about what is fake news, our definitions at the outset are really quite important. So that's the first thing. Our framework is everyone has the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds. The second is that states retain the ability, the capacity to restrict information and ideas, to restrict expression under certain conditions. And famously, we talk about in the freedom of expression world a three-part test. And that three-part test is that states may impose restrictions so long as the restrictions are provided by law and they're necessary and proportionate in order to achieve a legitimate purpose. So those are the three parts of the test. Provided by law, so legality, necessity and proportionality, and third, legitimate objective. And those legitimate objectives are actually rooted in the law, and that's to protect the rights or reputations of others, national security or public order, or public health and public morals. So we have a framework of law. We have a framework that's normative that I think should be the basis for us to think about the fake news problem or the junk news problem. So there are a couple of risks that I want to address first. So one substantive risk is in definition. So what is fake news? What is junk news? What is disinformation? What is propaganda? I think this is a good subject for us to discuss, maybe in the Q&A. From my perspective, fake news has to have some intentionality around it. Disinformation has to have the intention about it, not only to present untruthful, false information, but to do so with the purpose of essentially changing policy, changing people's minds. It has to have that intentionality about it. It can't be that false news or fake news covers information that is accidentally false, that is put out there. So when we get into definitions, we need to be clear about that. It also has to be clear that we're not talking about forms of satire. In other words, the definition of fake news or disinformation needs to have an objective element, not a subjective one. A second risk, I think, that's related to this problem of definition is a kind of modeling issue. And that, what I mean by that is that what Europe might do or what the United States might do around this issue will have serious ramifications and echoes around the world. So while we're having this conversation about the spread of false information, there really are a set of actors out there who are maybe laughing at our debate, right? And those are authoritarians around the world that have laws that not only prohibit the dissemination of false information, but criminalize the dissemination of false information. And, you know, we could put up a map of the world and look at different places, whether we're talking about Egypt, for which several people have been prosecuted recently for the dissemination of false information, or Tajikistan, or any number of states where government criminalizes essentially false news. and does so on the basis really of the idea that the information is inconsistent with a government line. Government criticism, for example, is often framed as false information or defamation, and is criminalized. So we need to be very careful about our definitions, in part for this reason. The third point I want to make here around risks is that it's important for us to think about context as well. So I think one point is, in thinking about the definition, we have to think about the context in which information is shared. But we also have to think about the overall context of the decimation of traditional media outlets. So as Lisa Maria was suggesting, millions of people, certainly in the United States, get their news through social media and search engines. That's how they're getting their information. And what that has done over the last 10, 15 years is really undermined not only the authority, but in some ways the credibility of traditional media sources. It's also undermined them in very significant economic ways. So the context in which we're thinking about these issues, I think, is quite important, because it's not just a question of what news is available to people. It's also a question of what countervailing news sources are available to individuals. And I think that goes to some of the solutions that I'll talk about toward the end. The last point I want to make around context and risks is that as we're thinking about the problem, I think it's critical for us to develop as much as we can empirical data about the impact of fake news on our politics. I think that the computational propaganda project is essential in showing us what's happening, and I think the next step will be for social scientists in particular to really do research around the impact of the trends that the project shows on our politics. I don't think it's enough for us to simply say, for example, as shocking and as stark as it is that there was this one-to-one balance between the sharing of false information and other information on social media in the United States, but we also need to know the impact that that's actually had on public opinion. And I think that we're starting to see that research, and it's very difficult research to do, actually. But it's research that we need to have in order to know what kind of solutions we might want to adopt. So I want to now talk a little bit about the joint declaration that my colleagues from the OSCE, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights agreed to this past March. This was a joint declaration that we issue every year, a declaration on a matter related to freedom of opinion and freedom of expression, and we've done so in past years around issues such as CVE, countering violent extremism, issues around competition policy, and so forth, other areas of freedom of expression law. And I want to just highlight a few of the areas where we essentially had a consensus. And I think these are some areas that might hopefully help us in thinking about some of the solutions for the problem, to the extent there are solutions, at least to think about strategies for dealing with fake news today. So I'll list about 6 different issues that we identified in this joint declaration. So the first is the question of censorship. So I think that there's a very significant risk that the responses to the fake news problem will result not just in takedowns and the filtering of information that might be legitimately filtered or taken down. But I think that there's a risk of overregulation, as was mentioned by Lisa Maria in her presentation, and significant censorship of information that does not fit into one of those categories under Article 19 of the ICCPR. And I think that to the extent that member states in the European Union or the European Commission start to look at this and deal with this problem, we need to be very alive to the problem that any solution that we deal with might actually result in censoring fully legitimate information, and we very much need to resist that temptation. As part of that, so this second point in the joint declaration is that there needs to remain a critical role for public authorities, in particular the courts. I'm particularly concerned about laws like the recent German net DG law that really takes courts out of the process of regulating content. I think we could talk a little bit about the German law maybe in the Q&A, in part because it generated a significant amount of discussion. I think it's still generating discussion in Europe. I think there were some positive elements in terms of the back and forth between the public and critics of the law and the German government in terms of paring back some of the really problematic parts of the legislation. But one part of the law, this isn't addressed specifically in our joint declaration, but I think what I'm trying to say is from our joint declaration, part of the law really takes out the role of the public and public authorities in thinking about what is legitimate content and what is illegal content. And so we're essentially asking, or the German government is asking companies to regulate that space. And we need to think very carefully about how far down that road we want to go. The third issue, and this is related to that, is the question of intermediary liability. Clearly, and so the joint declaration makes the point that any solutions, any attempts to deal with fake news need to not put liability on the companies for third-party content. Now, the companies can be encouraged to do certain things, and again, the German law actually does encourage companies to do some important things around transparency that I think are extremely valuable. But to put the liability on the companies rather than on the third parties that are actually producing the content is significantly problematic. And I'll just name one reason. To the extent that fines, penalties for fake news and for allowing fake news and not taking down fake news are exceptionally high, those costs may be absorbed by some of the biggest companies. But those are costs that smaller actors in the digital environment simply cannot handle. And so they'll either be pushed out of the digital marketplace or they will significantly reduce their space for freedom of expression. So there are very real risks if we impose, or states impose liability on the intermediaries. A fourth point is really more of a positive agenda. And so I want to make 2 points that are really positive agendas for us to think about. First is that governments have obligations regarding the kind of information that they disseminate. This is often overlooked when we're talking about fake news because obviously we see the problems very often in terms of bots, of different actors who might have nefarious purposes for putting out, some of which are profit motive purposes. But we forget often that governments also have an obligation to create environments that are friendly to freedom of opinion and expression. And that means also disseminating truthful information rather than what I think often happens or has been happening, the dissemination and, in a sense, the flooding of the marketplace with false information that actually undermines the public's right to truthful information. And so I think it's important for us to restate over and over that while we're dealing with the fake news problem, it's also important for governments to stay out of the fake news business and to ensure access to information that is truthful. The second part of that positive agenda is that governments need to be supporting an environment for freedom of opinion and expression. And that should also mean, to the extent that they're able to do this, encouraging and perhaps even funding, to a certain extent, local news and alternative and public media sources to counter some of the false news that's been described already. That's long been seen as an obligation of states to create that kind of environment and to support public media. And I think now is an important moment to restate that and to reinvigorate that. I'm going to conclude with the last part. I haven't spoken that much about the responsibility of intermediaries themselves. And I think that one of the things that we've seen over the last several years is the development of intermediaries and the social media space and the search space that they've created as privately held space that billions, I mean literally billions of people consider to be the public forum. So the question for these intermediaries is what law applies on their platform? Is that law, because it is essentially law, it's regulating our expression to a very significant extent. So is that law, are those private content regulations to be drawn from human rights law? Or are they to be drawn from, say, community standards, to borrow a phrase that one company uses? And to what extent should those rules be based on public input? To what extent should the implementation of those rules be transparent and clear to their users? Or, as we refer to users, individuals, right? So we need to be demanding that as the intermediaries are implementing rules and trying to deal with the problem that we're talking about, that they do so in a way that as closely as possible adheres to the same public norms that we expect of governments, particularly because these private actors have developed and managed space that for all intents and purposes is public space today. So I'll close there. I think that there's some reason to be optimistic. So I should close with a note of optimism because there's so much downer, so much depressing news out there these days. The optimism that I think we should reflect upon is that in the face of the fake news, and I've persisted in saying fake news rather than junk news, I'm a creature of habit. But in the face of this onslaught, if we want to call it that, as we've seen in some of the data, there's been a reinvigoration of the media, in particular investigative journalism. We've certainly seen this in the United States over the last 6 months. I think we're seeing it also in Europe. And I think to the extent that journalists themselves and media outlets themselves are responding to this challenge, and responding, and philanthropies and foundations are to a certain extent responding to the challenge as well, we should encourage that, and we should see some potential for the response being positive and for building out from there into areas like media literacy and other areas which will be generational in many respects. But at least for the moment, I think we're seeing a response that we could, to a certain extent, be proud of, even if the problem still persists. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for a very comprehensive, clear, structured, and at times encouraging, but at times also discouraging assessment of where we are. We have a few minutes for questions. Don't be shy. Yes, and if you could briefly say who you are, that will help us.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Frederik de Bakker. I work for Telefonica. Thank you very much. I mean, I think it's a very interesting debate. I have a bit of a question. I was a bit surprised also in the second intervention on strategies that the issue of educating the public was not included in themselves debunking fake news, because listening to the first intervention, comparing the phenomenon, what's new to the propaganda, it's basically the issue of social networks, which means especially user-generated content, which means loss of control by governments and corporates, because you said propaganda always exists. Before it was basically governments and incorporates, and now it's a democratization of propaganda, so everybody can and you say, well, the solution, of course, cannot be only have, again, propaganda from governments and corporates, so the propaganda will be there. So perhaps the strategy of educating people themselves, spotting the fake news, is also a very important ingredient in the debate. It's a good question.
Suggestion. Interesting contradiction in terms, I guess, democratization of propaganda. But let's discuss further. Yes, go ahead.
So I wanted to get just kind of raise a few points that has been talked. Who am I? So I run a startup that's trying to combat fake news. It's called Fact Matter. So we're really in this debate, and one of the things that we think about, which I think should be part of the discussion around legislation, is moving away from an ad-driven model. I've certainly made the distinction in our company that junk news is a better way of describing fake news, but I'd argue that the incentives for a Macedonian teenager versus an ad-driven publisher are exactly the same. It's just that the Macedonian teenager is just doing a better job per that optimization function. So I'd like to I think one of the things that should be thought about is, and that relates to search engines, it relates to news feeds. Should the metric that that these platforms kind of measure themselves against, is it engagement, and is it clicks, and is that the best way that our information ecosystem and the way that we educate our citizens should be based upon, or should there be some other metric which is education and providing people with different perspectives, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think I'd love that to be part of the debate.
Thank you. It's very interesting. We think a lot about how to apply the rule of law online and how to safeguard the public interest in an increasingly privatized space online. So it fits very well in that context. Thank you. Other questions? Yes. There's a button next to them. Yes.
Hello, Caroline J. from Media for Democracy. We're supporting too close? Yeah. We're supporting DEFCO B1 in freedom of expression implementation with EU delegations. There are very often debates and conversations about propaganda and fake news that conclude that media literacy is important, but as a reminder, media literacy is one of the most underfunded aspects of media assistance and support to freedom of expression, according to the latest report of CIMA and National Endowment for Democracy. So first question is, how do we act on this? And secondly, actually I forgot, but that was the main thing. Yeah. I'm sorry. In fact, there are also studies showing that even when people receive, users and audiences receive the proofs that something is wrong and something is false, they don't necessarily change their habits or opinions. So how do we do to tackle that? It's not just about rationality, it's very irrational.
Thank you. Let's keep it with those three. Go back to the panel, then we'll switch panels and the discussion continues after that. Who would like to start?
Yeah, maybe to first come back to your last point when we were talking about debunking and how debunking oftentimes doesn't work. It's true that there's a lot of research that is exactly tackling this issue right now. How can we design debunking messages that are actually being heard and that are being accepted, and how should those messages be designed? And to expand on that, I think that is not the only problem, but I think the other problem is that debunking messages don't spread with the same dynamics as junk news messages spread. So, for example, you might have a big junk news story. In Germany, one of the biggest junk news stories in the past year was that immigrants could get a driver's license for free. Obviously, that was debunked right away, but that message still got incredibly big and got shared thousands and millions of times. And the idea behind that is that even if you have efficient debunking that is coming from credible institutions, etc., it's still very hard to target the kind of people that are prone to believing junk news. And so for that, I think we need to go back to technology and think about how can we develop strategies to make sure that debunking is heard and also is targeted at the people and also is received by the people that are reading junk news.
So I'll try to address a few of these questions, but I'll start also with the debunking. I think another concept that we should think about is prebunking, which I didn't invent. There's a lot of research on prebunking. And so one question is, how do we get information that's truthful out into different spaces online in advance of the material that needs to be debunked later. And there's good research that shows that when someone is presented with the pre-bunk before, it's a little bit harder for the false information to solidify itself in the mind of the recipient. So I think there's some work to be done around debunking and pre-bunking. Absolutely right about media literacy being underfunded. So that goes to the point of governments really needing to create environments that are sensitive to and supportive of freedom of expression. And they're not doing that. And the money isn't coming so much from foundations either. So the call needs to be to all of these different actors, I think. So in terms of private fact-checking, I guess I'm going in reverse order, there over the last year, although this has developed over the last several years, there've really been an explosion to a certain extent in fact-checking enterprises like yours, but there are several others out there. AfriCheck, I think, is one that's done a really good job in Africa, just as an example. So I think those need to continue, and clearly, I mean, you're asking the right question, which is how does the fact-checking get out there in a way that attracts the same kind of clicks that the bad or junk news is getting. I mean, that's a problem for the companies to solve, but also for governments and other actors in civil society to think about. I mean, I don't have the answer, but I think you're asking absolutely the right question. And of course, for some of the fact-checking, the more support, because most of the organizations are relatively under-resourced, as you probably know. I'm doing a pitch for you here. They should be funded as well, whether by governments or foundations, because that's going to be imperative. I would say one thing, and so this goes to public education, and I don't think we covered everything in part because we just weren't comprehensive. Public education is clearly a part of it, and the public education can be done by governments, by civil society actors, by fact checkers. It can also be done by some of these platforms. So some of the platforms are trying to address the problem by giving essentially signals to the user, to the reader, of what's legitimate and what's not, at least to the sophisticated user of technology, a way to weigh the information that they see. So is there a quick way to see the URL? Is there a quick way to see the URL of the post when it was created? All of those kinds of things, I mean, those are, that's beyond clicks, right? This requires the user to do something in addition, and I think some of the big social media companies in particular are thinking about how to make that evident to people so that they can do their own kind of fact check, or at least add a little bit of skepticism to their consuming of information. But a lot of this at public education levels, media literacy levels, is unfortunately generational. And because we're early to a very real extent in the digital revolution, we're figuring this out at a time where we're also seeing a lot of problems be caused by it. But you're absolutely right. The education part has to be central to it.
With that, and I think it's a very good starter of the rest of the afternoon, we're going to close this first panel, and I really want to thank Lisa, Maria, and David for their great contributions, and you all for your questions, and we'll do a little shuffle up here, but bear with us.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we continue our exchange with the second session. Since with Marietje and Morten, I represent ALDE, I should introduce our political group. Our political group, as Liberals and Democrats for Europe, stand for fewer rights, human rights, for more regulation, and definitely for weaker European Union. All is said is fake or junk, but it's up to the competence of each and every audience to judge. I mean, you are competent enough, to debunk myself from those news pronounced, and you are able to make your own conclusions. But how many audiences are able to do that? Especially if behind those news stand state systematically funded, well-funded, well-organized institutions. And if it is a part of the state policy line. You know that non-military means become more and more important in achieving political and strategic goals. The less democratic country is, the more it's inclined to support these means. And let's not be abstract. There is a country neighboring the European Union, as Russia, which is very much active in employing all those means and producing lots of propaganda and fake news flow towards the European Union. Why is that? They are not against single politicians or political parties. They are in principle against the liberal democracy, what is the background of the European Union. And this is very well organized, and it's already out of laboratories, it's out of single minds, it's a part of the state policy line. How to explain it and how it is organized, the second session is about to try to explain to you. And I'm very happy to have two great panelists who are good experts on some particular country and those means which are employed by Russia. First of all, I want to introduce Boris Reitschuster, who is a well-known German journalist. He spent some 6 years in Moscow. 16? Oh, gee. All right.
Quite a difference.
Quite a difference. And in fact, during those 16 years, and as I can see from the time period, you saw a complete transformation of Russia from being a very partner of the European Union, although not an easy one, to a great opponent of us. And indeed, you earned even a good name as one of the leading experts for Russia in Germany. And my second panelist, whom we will have a pleasure to listen to, is Richard Jozwek. He speaks many languages, explains his surname and a name well. He works for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Before, he was employed by and represented Amnesty International and reported good news from such regions as Western Balkans on the issue of EU enlargement, relations between the European Union and Russia. So, gentlemen, you have a task to explain to us what's wrong with us and some countries which want to oppose us, especially using the information warfare.
Thank you very
Boris.
much. First of all, I was a little bit surprised when I heard you, Mr. Kay, because you were speaking about hysteria and that we exaggerated, and I don't live in the States, so maybe that's the point in the States, I dare to believe you. But in Germany, I have the impression that exactly the opposite is going on, and far over Europe, that we underestimate it, and for Germany, I would even say that we are in some kind of denial. I'll explain to you. When I had to go back to Germany after 16 years in Russia in 2012, due to death threats I got, and really was arrested and many things, and kicked down, I was very surprised when in 2014 with the Crimean crisis, I found some things I had thought I would see only in Russia. For example, these trolls, which I knew very well from Russia. And we had them in Germany, and when I told people, I told them, oh, don't believe it. It's not really what people are thinking. You know, there's something like trolls. People look at me like at a psychopath, you know. They said, oh, what are you telling us? Fairy tales, trolls, nothing like that. And no one wanted to believe this in 2014. And the same about fake news. People were in deep denial, and only after the US elections people started to think about it. I know when I wrote my book about Putin's hidden war in Europe 1.5 years ago, also people thought, oh, it's complete nonsense, and he speaks about interfering in some elections, about some fake news, could never happen. And unfortunately in Germany we are not so much aware of this. What is the reason for Putin? I think we have to understand very clearly why he's doing this. And I'm deeply convinced now that it's not an act of aggression from his side, but in his mind, he's really, I know him for 16 years, I know him personally, and I think he's deeply convinced that Russia is attacked himself, because Russia and himself, for him it's the same, you know, and because we criticize lack of democracy, violation of human rights, he thinks that we are in a hidden war against him. And you can read also in the Gerasimov doctrine, where he describes this exactly, and where he's clearly saying that we use disinformation techniques, we use attacks on information systems. You can read it black on white from the main military man in Russia, and nevertheless so many people do not understand it. But it's very important that we understand first of all that from Putin's point of view it's defensive. And why he's using these techniques. And you will be very surprised now when I compare it with a famous German soccer player. You will say, what a soccer player has in common with Vladimir Putin. But you'll understand. We had his player, Wolf Russmann. He was playing with Borussia Mönchengladbach, and they had a match against Borussia Dortmund. And Wolf Russmann said these famous words, which are one-to-one you can take for Putin. He says, we are a much weaker team. We have no chance against Borussia Dortmund, but we can destroy the field, the green. We can destroy the field of the game. That's exactly what the tactics, the strategy of Putin is. He knows he's weak towards the European Union, because it's in economic terms, in military teams, he's very weak. But he's trying to destroy our field, to destroy the basics of our democracy, and he's quite successful at this. Also because we're always thinking about what's his technique in the game, some new field, and we do not look at the green. We do not look at the field. What is the big difference between the Russian propaganda in Soviet times and now? Soviet times propaganda always wanted to convince them that the Soviet Union is doing the right thing, we are good people. Putin even doesn't try it. doesn't try to tell us that Russia is doing good things. And even his supporters in the West, they do not say that Russia is so democratic at all. No, his tactics is to say, everywhere everything is bad. Yes, okay, we have no real democracy, okay. But there's no real democracy at all. We have violations of human rights, okay, we have it. But others have this violation as well. And he's undermining our values. He's undermining our values in democracy, in freedom of speech, in all those things. And whatever you tell now about Russia in Germany, for example, you always get these answers which are quite trained by this Russian propaganda machine. Always people say, yes, okay, but the American states do the same. And it's very, very deep already in our minds. And it's very, very dangerous, because if you justify Russian war and all these authoritarian regimes, if you justify it with other examples in history, then let me provoke you, but after Adolf Hitler you could justify anything, any crime, anything in the world if you always try to relativate it and always say yes, but others have do the same. And that's a very, very undermining thing. He does not try us to believe that he's telling the truth. He tries to make us believe that there is no truth at all. That is very, very important to understand. And that is exactly the way he's working. For example, we had this MH17, the plane, you remember, which was shut down over the Ukraine. And immediately you had all these things I call it distraction actions. For example, some versions said the plane was full of corpses which the CIA put there, and that it was all inscenation, that it was all a work of the CIA, and you had the absurdist theories. And this propaganda, it's very, very clever. They very, very clever choose their auditory. In Germany, it's quite smart. For example, when we had here in Brussels this tragic terrorist attack, maybe you remember, all this fake news machinery of Putin, they posted a picture of Angela Merkel, which she took with a refugee selfie, and they wanted to make us believe that this refugee was the murderer of Brussels, which he wasn't at all. So for Germany, quite in a quite delicate way. For Georgia, former Soviet Union, their fake news facilities, they put a story that Angela Merkel is the unknown daughter of Adolf Hitler, that CIA frozen some sperma of Adolf Hitler and made Angela Merkel out of it, and that CIA put Angela Merkel this way to the Chancellor's office. You see, in Germany it would not work so well. It's for Germany, and that's very clever. And that's one very dangerous thing. We had this old KGB propaganda, which was quite stupid in some way. You could understand very well that it's propaganda, but it was absolutely without conscience and without any borders or limits. They were really rude. And now you have American PA agencies like Ketchum, like Personal Mass Dollar, who are working together with the Kremlin, and you have the worst thing of both systems. Yes, you have on the one side these techniques which are originally for product placement, for advertising, for things which are quite harmless, and on the other hand, you have these ruthless aims, and these both things together, it's something like a Frankenstein monster, which we get in this way, and that makes it so dangerous. And I was in Lithuania at a conference of the Russian opposition with Tautas Landsbergis, a big, great old man from Lithuania. He was the former president, one of the heroes of liberation of Soviet Union. And he said, "You Westerners," he said, "you do not understand. He said, you are in a war. It's a war against your civilization," he said. He said, "It's a war against your values, against democracy. And it's not only Putin," he said, "it's also Erdogan. There are also others." And he said, "And you are in denial. You are even afraid of admitting it. You are even afraid of thinking of itself." And that's exactly what is so dangerous. I was in Stanford in June, and we had some meetings behind closed doors with people from Facebook, from Google, from Twitter. And I was really surprised, because you always think these guys know what they are doing. But they don't know themselves how it is working out. And I had one old professor there, and he told it in a very impressive way. He said, we invented a technology which made it possible to get money from posting cat pictures, and now we slowly understand that this technology is undermining our democracy. The system we have built. And one of the advisors of Putin, he used a very, very impressive picture. He said, the situation now, it is like as if Stalin had the nuclear weapons in 1942. Because Russians are very clever at using all these technologies, and it's very, very impressing how little idea we have how to deal with it. In Stanford, it became very clear that, you said it already, Mr. Kay and Mrs. Neudert, that there's a quite different approach. Americans think they can solve this issue with technology, something like a spam filter, filter for fake news. Europeans think about the freedom of speech and all these issues, and how dangerous it is. We see in Germany with this new Facebook law, how you called it. And you know what's the terrifying thing with this Facebook law in Germany? That the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament, which is no parliament in my eyes at all, it's some pseudo-parliament, it's playing parliament, that they have now a new initiative for a new law in Russia, and say clearly that our example is the German law and we do everything what has been in Germany. It's not the Jews, of course, they are playing this game, but they have a little point, do they have, and that's very, very dangerous. And to come to the end, I think, first of all, we have to understand why this Russian propaganda now is so successful and hasn't been in Soviet times. First of all, social media, of course, American PR agencies, but it's also so successful because we are so weak, because we lost our belief in our values. We do not understand anymore, especially Europeans, Americans understand it more, that we have to fight for our values. That there is something like an enemy. Unfortunately, I would also rather believe that there is no enemy at all. And Germans are like, like in the kindergartens. We always think, if Putin says some bad things, we have to speak with him. We have to sit on the table and we will decide anything. Tanks in the eastern Ukraine, how will you sit on the table? Every day fire, every day people killed. And unfortunately, we have to understand, it's great that we became political vegetarians in Germany and in Western Europeans, but not everywhere all players in the world are vegetarians. And we have to deal with this fact. At least we have to acknowledge it. And to end, two examples what we could do. Yes, we are thinking so much, but two examples which are really in my eyes sad. We have Russia Today, RT, and it's really a propaganda tool, and we have it on our cable and on our satellite in Germany. I do not understand why. Freedom of speech, it does not mean that you give people who want to undermine your freedom of speech the biggest speaker. It's like if you know that someone wants to get inside your house to put some very dirty words on your wall, you not necessarily have to give him the keys and the elevator access, that he can do it in an easy way. And I think freedom of speech, okay, no way to forbid RT, of course, but why do we give them for free the access to every household in our country? They should do their propaganda at least at their own cost and with their own infrastructure. We are also not allowed to be inside of Russia in the media in infrastructure. Why are we so stupid? And the second point, in Germany we have 3 to 4 million Russian-speaking people. We have no television for them at all. All these people in the evening when they want to relax after work, seeing some movie, something in their native language, we give them away to the Russian propaganda machines. They have to switch on Russian television, and after the movie they see some brain washing news, and for all these years we had only much talking in Germany. We have even a law where everybody has to pay media tax, and all these 3 or 4 million Russian-speaking people pay this media tax and do not get any Russian-speaking media. And I say we could do so easy steps, yes, and not thinking about the steps which are further going. And we should at least consider to take this little, very obvious steps. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Boris. At once you can see you spent 16 years, not 6 years in Russia. Richard, the floor is yours.
This morning I got an email from my editor with an article from Sputnik News. The article was written probably yesterday, and I got it in the morning around 8 o'clock, and he asked, is this true? The article was about the EU giving 2 million euros to, according to the article, spread EU propaganda in Serbia because the Serbs don't believe in the EU anymore. As a Brussels correspondent for 8 years, I went to the usual channel, which is the European Commission in this sense, and I sent them the article and said, guys, is there any truth into this? Is there some truth? Is there any 2 million? Can you please explain? Shortly afterwards, this was already around 9 o'clock, I got a reply saying, yes, Rika, we will look into it. What's your deadline? As soon as possible, as always. Sure. It's now 16:22. Do you think I've got a reply? No, of course not. And this is not sort of me aiming a cheap dig at the European Commission, even though I know that in this House this is very popular. Because I know that these things take time. It took half an hour probably to write that article. It took 5 seconds to put it on Twitter. When I checked this morning, this had been retweeted, this article, about 200 times. It's been shared 60 times. It's already spread to other Western Balkan media. And 7 hours later, the European Commission doesn't have a reply to these set. And I'm not blaming them, because it takes time to fact-check. Days, hours, weeks, I've done it myself. The problem is, though, and I can actually finish my speech here already now, I mean, this is why we're losing, in a sense. And also, to go back to what Boris said, this is why we don't really understand what we're up to. And we don't take it seriously. 2 other anecdotes from last week to further illustrate that, in fact, Russia must be doing all this, but there is a bigger enemy here, and that's us, and not understanding what we're actually up against here. Last week, Federica Mogherini, the EU Foreign Policy Chief, and Jean-Claude Juncker, the EU Commission President, were addressing a collection of EU ambassadors, so people who are representing us abroad, outside the EU. They both gave a speech of about 30 to 35 minutes. I think Mogherini's was 32 minutes. Juncker, who speaks longer, 36 minutes, I think it was. How much of those 36 or 32 minutes do you think they dedicated to strategic communication, fake news, anything of this sort that we're talking about today? How much?
If any. 5 minutes? If any. If any.
I think Petras is on it. 0. 0. And these are our main highest diplomats in the EU and the Commission President. How much do you think they, to go back a bit to Russia, how much did they spend on talking about Russia and Ukraine? Mogherini was passing Ukraine in about 5 seconds, talking about, it's important. 5 seconds, that was it. Juncker did talk 2 minutes about these things. And what he said was, on Ukraine, he was finding an opportunity to misquote the Ukrainian president, who, according to him, said that Ukraine is already a member of NATO and EU. This was a misrepresentative quote by the Commission President, but he still felt the need to say that this is not the case. You are not a member of the EU and NATO. Fine. On Russia, he said, and I think this is something to do with, a Luxembourgish sort of small complex fact, He said that Russia is, 17, 15 times bigger than the EU, so we cannot have European security without Russia. And I hope that by these different illustrations, and I can give more of them, you realize actually what we're up to here, or what we're not up to, and what the problem actually is. Russian propaganda will be there all the time, but we have no clue actually where to start, and that is the problem. A final example. East Stratcom, EU East Stratcom, you've probably heard of it. It's a very good piece in the External Action Service, consisting of 10 to 15 people who will actually sort of try to disseminate Russian propaganda, both in the Eastern Partnership countries, but also in the EU. They were created in 2015, and in 2016, when they've been up and running for about a year, they invited the Brussels media for a conversation, what they have done for 1 year, what they have found out. Everyone was there. It was BBC, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, 35 journalists. It was a very good presentation, actually, of what they have done, and they're doing a lot of great stuff. But then in the end of the presentation say, by the way, guys, this is all on background. So the EU is in fact doing strategic communication off the record, whereas Russian bots are churning out facts, misfacts about us every second. And I don't know who laughed the loudest when said that, about strategic communication off the record, if it was Franz Kafka or Vladimir Putin himself. And then there's also, the main issue is that we actually don't know how many messages are being sent out in Europe. I mean, there are certain countries that are doing this, so 24-hour monitoring. There are very few, usually in eastern part of the European Union. But what we actually don't know is this going on all over Europe? Because we don't have a 24 hours monitoring. We don't have it in all EU member states. There has been no political will, and that's the problem. There's no political will. Underline that. There's no political will to find that out. We don't even know the basics here. How many bots are there? How many people, how many trolls are there that are sending out this sort of stuff? How many messages are they sending out to the different EU countries? What are the different messages in different EU countries? Because as Boris said, they are tailor-making it to different things. When it comes to Germany, for example, they talk about migrants and possibly sort of peace stories, like peaceniks. They refer to those peaceniks. In Hungary, for example, it might be EU bashing. These are the sort of things. But we don't know how many messages there are there, how many through media, how many people are actually reading this, and how many people are actually believing in this. These things, we still don't know. And that's where to start things. But there is no start anymore. But I think there's one thing more, which is, I suppose, is something more deeper political about this, and it's about the sort of sphere where fake news thrives. And that is also something that we need to address on a higher level, actually, in a sense, in a bigger political level, because these are about big political thoughts, in a sense. And I would highlight, I think, 3 dates that are significant in Europe in the last, I would say, 15 years. The first one was 2003 and the Iraq War. I think quite a lot of people, apart from those who always believed in conspiracy theories, with the Iraq War, I think there were many people who actually started questioning the West in general and the moral sort of obligations we have. Sort of the moral, not saying that we're a moral superpower, but many people started to question this about our moral authority. Do we really have it? Larger than the sort of maybe 5% that usually believe in conspiracy theories, I think there were much more people who really started with the Iraq War to question, is the mainstream media lying to us? Is politicians lying to us? Then I fast forward another 5 years with the financial crisis in 2008 that hit this continent very hard. And I think there were a lot of people here as well that sort of thinking, hang on a minute here, is the state really working for us here? It seems like the numbers, or like economics is stacked against us. You know, we talk about the 1% that has everything, and the 99% who has very little. Going back again to 2015 in migration crisis, and I think again that there was something here where people outside those who always believe in conspiracy theories that started to question both state actors and mainstream media, saying that, hang on a minute, is there not a contradiction between, for example, having open borders on the one hand, and at the same time proposing welfare societies, generous welfare societies? Those three things, Iraq war, financial crisis, and the migration crisis, has created a vacuum for many people who are a bit disenfranchised about certain things or many things in Western society, more than it was before. Added that together with social media, they have suddenly got a space to express those frustrations. And I think here, in this blurred line, Russia is taking advantage, but also others are taking advantage of this. They are co-opting these people who feel disenfranchised. And this is something we must understand as well. And what is very important here is sort of not to dismiss these people as stupid, as being racist, whatever. Because it's really here goes to the heart of the matter, where politicians and politics, especially liberals, have to come up and say, well, you know, we need to find a strategy, a grand strategy for this as well. This is not something that's being done tomorrow. But what Russia will continue to do in the future is to grab on this, what I would call identity politics. And what you see, for example, if you go to Facebook page of Russia Today, it's mainly about people from other countries, in a sense, coming over here in boats. They are, you know, they're raping our women. They are, you know, beating up people. And this is sort of saying that it might not be factually true, but many people have a perception of it. And that is very important. We talk a lot about facts, but it's also about challenging perceptions. And that's what is the really important. People are sometimes not caring about so much about facts. But if these things on the street say, well, you know, I feel that, you know, my wages have not been growing, that, you know, we cannot be Christian here anymore, we cannot be Jewish here anymore, whatever. And it's these sort of things that Russia is exploiting all the time. And we need to find an answer to that as Europeans, but also as political parties. And on that happy note, questions?
Thank you, Rickard. And I'm looking at the audience and looking forward to receive your questions to great panelists. First lady in white.
Hello. Oh, that's too loud, sorry. My name is Mara Miano. I'm a master's student researching artificial intelligence and its potential effects on political decision-making. I wanted to get your journalist perspective on internet censorship and how it can have an influence on misinformation. So social media in China and Russia differ from most Western countries because they have heavier internet censorship. Majority of internet users in these countries only use much fewer social media platforms like VK, Weibo, WeChat, all of which are subsidized by the state. So in a spatial sense, their online information environments are smaller and denser and can be more easily controlled by the government. I have two questions. Do you think this control gives states like China or Russia more power in proliferating online propaganda to their citizens? And second, do you think this gives them an advantage over the West in proliferating online propaganda, since the West cannot easily access their social media compared to how they can easily access Western social media?
Can you share those questions? Yeah, of course. Right.
First of all, of course, in Russia it helps them very much, but in contrast to China, they don't have a big Chinese virtual wall in Russia. So Putin is very, very clever at leaving some points where he still leaves some some points of freedom, and he's using the fact that most people do not use internet for political information. It's a big contrast to Russia, and they have still no need in a full censorship in the internet. And of course it's some advantage for them, and in Germany I think we make a huge mistake with this law, because in reality we have already the laws that there are illegal things which you cannot express and which should go to trial. But we do not use at the moment these legal steps. I get death threats through the internet. I get insulting things, but I already... Yeah, all the time. And I gave up on involving the jurisdictional system, because I do not say, do not deal with it. They do not want to deal with it, they don't do anything. And what we are doing now is outsourcing it to the companies itself. And in my case, for any liberal person, this is awful, because you cannot give state authorities limitation of freedom of speech to any private company. And for Putin, this is a huge opportunity to use this for his propaganda, to say, you see, Germany, it's even worse than we, which is of course not the fact, but he can deceive many people with that.
To answer very quickly, I mean, if you ask China, Russia more effective in that sense than the West, yeah, of course they are. I mean, yes. It's simple like that. I mean, they can control these sort of channels. They don't do it to 100%, of course. And this is sort of where the two things clash. I mean, we don't want to control it, and we don't think that we can control it, actually, because in a sense, I mean, it's infinite in a sense. So you don't even try to start controlling it, because that would go against our values in a sense. I don't think anyone here would really accept it. So, of course, it's an efficient way for dictates to control these sort of things, and they are more effective by nature. It's the way it is.
All right, thank you. I'm looking forward to receive more questions. Is it everything so clear on Russia?
Then I would add one
like-minded.
very short
Absolutely.
I would like to ask to add one very important moment in Russia. You know, we had these two prognoses. We had Orwell and we had Huxley. And Orwell said that that in future there will be forbidden books and other opinions. And Huxley said, no, it will not be necessary to forbid books. It's just necessary to make people not to read them. And that's exactly the way Russia is going on. So he made people just being uninterested in politics, and even this fake news, when you have the impression everything is ugly, everybody lies, you cannot believe no one. So people, even if there is somewhere the truth in the internet, people do not understand it, they are not interested in it anymore. And that's quite a big difference to the way China is dealing with it, and that makes it even more dangerous. And we have the same tendency in the West, that we are, like Neil Postman said, we are amusing ourselves to death, yes? So people are also losing interest in reading, in being politically informed, and we have this development here also, and it's very dangerous, I think. In fact, it's even not less dangerous than censorship.
Absolutely.
Actually, one thing to what Boris said before about Russia today, it's quite an interesting point, actually, because he said that, you know, why are we, in a sense, giving a key to someone who wants to destroy our house? And it's a good point, but I think there's something else that I think would work even better when it comes to Russia today, and I'm talking now about the actual television rather than social media, where it's much more difficult to control anything. But on TV, I mean, I don't know if you've ever watched Russia today. It's a very slick channel. It's quite good TV, actually. It's entertaining. But every now and then they have commercial breaks. And there you're going to see everything from IKEA to iPhone having ads there. And a whole parade of other Western companies who are actually paying for that sort of space. So if we really want to do something about Russia today as a TV, politicians can say, sorry, but, you know, Western companies should not finance fake news going against ourselves. We are paying for this. You guys are paying for this. This is the sort of thing. We are paying for people to hurt us. And that's one thing where you can stop it almost immediately, you know.
It's the same with Facebook and big data, yes? For example, Facebook sells its data to Russia Today, and so they know exactly, for example, for Germany, which people have something against refugees, which people are homophobe, and then Russia Today can place its advertisement exactly to those people. We have these tools, results of our free community, of our free society, and we sell them to themselves. And it remembers me of Lenin, who said that Westerners will sell us the rope to hang us, and I would add, we would even give them the credit because they do not have the money. Loan, yes. Capitalist, exactly, yes. Bourgeois.
All right. I have a question. I mean, you've been quite critical about the Western response, to Russian propaganda and disinformation, and even quoting simply no quote of Mrs. Mogherini about strategic communication. But do you see any progress, any increasing or emerging understanding on EU side, and any proportional action back, to disinformation? Can you quote any positive things?
Well, incidentally, last week, I'm also perhaps doing some bit of fake news. Incidentally, there was some good news last week as well, actually. I saw that Juncker, who was my villain before, actually tasked the new digital commissioner, Mrs. Maria Gabriel, to set up a working group on fake news. And they're going to sort of be reporting, I think, or she's going to announce this formally, I think later this month in September. Once again, I'm going to be a bit skeptical here again. The problem is that what took him so long? Most people should have woken up after the American election and said, maybe we need a working group of fake news in the European Commission. But okay, we're here now, September 2017. They're going to set up a working group. But let me be a bit Brussels cynical here. This working group will assemble in September. It will take them a year to write a report by the time we're into 2018. Then it will take another few months before the European Commission will actually come up with a proposal. And by then we are in 2019, and those who follow Brussels, which I think many of you do, this is an election year in European politics, both when it comes, and we're going to change the European Commission, we're going to change a head of council, and we're going to change some MEPs. So that means that no legislation will be made in 2019, or very little. And that means that this working group probably will be a bit dusty, and no one will care about it when we go back here in the end of 2019.
Very short, I think it has been very bad, and now it's not so bad anymore. It's like if you're at your home and you feel that someone will break in, you have this burglar, then before American elections we were in a state where we said, oh, it's just the weather. No, I don't hear anything. No, there is nothing going on. And now we already have a discussion that maybe it could be someone breaking in, but we are still a little bit away from calling the police what we should do.
Richard, you should know that Mr. Juncker doesn't use smartphone. He has an old Nokia, which does not probably present him with the updated news. So he's a slower in a reaction. I have a question from the second row, and then Morten.
Yes, hello. My name is Michel Dardenne from the Maison du Peuple d'Europe, which you could define as a civil society association. And I'm very interested in the opinion of the two journalists here, who are, I think, quite in contact with the mass media, and that has been the news before the social networks came into action. And civil society has been constating that much fake news, junk news, as a matter of fact, traditionally comes from politicians, from mass media. I don't know if your country, the politicians are speaking the truth all the time, but in Belgium certainly not. And at least that's not only what mass media say, but that's also what social networks say. And don't you think that junk news is as much in mass media as in social networks. And don't you think also that social networks today isn't a little debunking all the junk news that we have had for the last 50 years in the mass media? And so how do we have to look at mass media today?
Thank you for this question. It's very important because I'm very critical towards mass media, the developments, and I agree with you that there's very many things which are going wrong with the mass media, and that's the reason why these fake news are so successful. Here I go with you, but one big line which we always mix up. Mass media makes huge mistakes and politicians are lying here also. But here is still a consensus that this should not be and that it should not be the normal state. And what this Russian approach is, to convince people that there is no truth at all. Everybody is lying. That's absolutely normal, and we can make any absurd things. And I think you won't read in Western serious mass media about the sperma of Adolf Hitler, which Angela Merkel came out from, and all those things. We have to be very critical towards ourselves. Here I go with you, but it's still a very big difference. And let me quote Garry Kasparov, a friend of mine, chess player. He always says what we should not compare and say it's the same Jack the Ripper and a doctor with a knife. Both have a knife, you know, both make mistakes. From both people die sometimes, but it's an absolute other intention and an absolute other way.
Thank you.
If I just may, I don't want to go with Russian interference, etc., but especially intra-European thing. We have projects here in Europe, for example, TTIP, CETA, free trade, etc., where we have people, politicians and journalists always trying to sell, oh, this is fantastic, this is for the better for everyone, while in civil society you have the opposite convictions. You have people saying, no, this is done with democracy, it's the power to the multinationals. And I mean, how do you handle these things? How is that opposition? How is it possible that mass media has such an overwhelming opinion that is so different than the overwhelming opinion over social networks on, for example, European projects with all these international treaties? Huh?
I think this would be issue for an own debate. I'm here with you. I see all these developments, but I think this is a huge issue. You have economic reasons. You have very different reasons. For example, mass media, the print media, is running out of money because of the crisis, and there are many reasons. And I think this would go too deep. And I'm with you with these problems, but again, don't compare a bad doctor with Jack the Ripper. Don't compare bad journalists with state propagandists. It's a huge difference. It's a very huge difference. And if you look at Russian television, it makes people hate. They spread hate. They spread aggression, and that's a very big difference from we always make this mistake, and it's a little bit like you know, it's still a big difference between a hotel which is run down, which has an absolutely crazy director, bed bugs and all those things, and a prison. You know, it's are totally different systems. And if you call us, if you say all these things, maybe we are bad, run-down hotel, but we still have freedom here, and we have other aims. You cannot compare these both things. You cannot compare media in a dictatorship with maybe a media which is working bad in a democracy. And I think probably you have never lived in a dictatorship. I've been living in Russia for very long, and it's a huge difference. Huge difference.
Morten.
Yeah, I've just done to sort of follow up to this because I think that most people, I wouldn't agree that most people don't see the dangers of the Russian system, at least not today. I mean, for me, there's before and after Trump, I guess, where we have a totally different awareness in the public as such, globally actually, at least in the Western Hemisphere. And so right now, I think the narrative of Mr. Putin is quite different. At least if you look at many of the member countries, you will see that he is considered an evil man, like you portrayed him also. So what is the problem? I don't think the perception now is the problem. I think that the problem is to find solutions. And now I come to my question, because I think that you two gentlemen has lined out very fine what the problems are. So I would like to maybe follow up on the solutions. Now you're very critical towards the Commission. In a minute we will have a representative of the Commission to sort of come back on this, because I think the Commission actually have done a lot already. We don't get the picture right here. But looking at, you're talking about the German solution as a catastrophe, I would agree on that. But what actually should be done here? We have Stratcom as one little issue, one little solution. But could you elaborate a little on that? What can be done now? You talk about legislation in 2019. I mean, as a liberal, I would say that the presumption here is that maybe legislation is not the solution. If not, then what? Could you elaborate a little more about that?
No, I mean, I was a bit unfair to the European Commission. It's true. I think the whole EU is actually a bit lagging behind, apart from a few member states. But there are a few things we can do. One thing is, as I mentioned a bit before, there are, apart from Lithuania, I think there's not a single Stratcom, strategic communication unit, usually exists in the Ministry of Defences of the different country that has a 24-hour monitoring of what's going on in their political space, in sort of social media and so on. I think Denmark is actually getting there very soon. I think that Czech Republic is modelling themselves of the Lithuanian case. There are people who are studying this that probably can tell exactly what is happening. But what we need is a pan-European answer to this as well, or making sure that the different MODs in all countries, not only in the Nordics and the Baltics, they're usually the one that are dealing with this. They're usually the one that's screaming the loudest when it comes to this. But I'm talking also about countries like Portugal and Italy and Bulgaria, these sort of countries where, in fact, Russia is having a lot of influence as well, to have a 24-hour monitoring first about, how big is the problem? How many bots are there that are targeting stuff in Italian or in Danish? And then actually see how much actually does it affect people. How many people are reading these things? This can be done. Of course, what we need is manpower and money. And I understand that we are out of a very big economical crisis. Maybe you don't want to spend money on these sort of things. But that goes back to the actual thing that was what I want to say. There is a lack of political will on a lot of actors here. And I pointed out the head of the External Action Service and the head of the Commission. But there are other member states as well, so I'm pointing at the Council as well, that don't even want to talk about this. Let's be frank. And so 24-hour monitoring in all EU member states, sharing notes and thinking actually about how many messages are there, where are they being sent from, what are they saying in the different countries, because I think they're saying different things about different things. Some target NATO, some target the EU and so on. Most of them target migration. And then actually come up with something, okay, what can we do about this?
I cannot agree with you. I can agree with you about EU. You know it better, maybe about the Benelux states. But for Germany, I can say we had an opinion poll, for example, a few weeks ago, and 86% of Germans would prefer Russian gas and not American gas. 86%. We have 7 parties which have chances to go to the Bundestag now, be elected in 2 weeks, and 5 of them have some competition who is closer to Putin. Including the Liberals. Including the Liberals now, which had a very clear position before and now unfortunately made some very bad changes in my eye. And so I hope that you're right and that in your countries, or mainly to you are so advanced already that you can think about these specific tools. But in Germany, at least, we should get a consensus that we are under attack, and you don't have this consensus in Germany that we are under attack. And then you could take these concrete steps. First of all, Russian-speaking free media, Russia Today, everywhere there. And but we are not so far already. We should first get a consensus that we are under attack, and Germans are mostly in denial about this.
Yes. The last question from, all right, two ones. I mean, we will take at once. A lady in black, second from the last, and then on the last row. Go ahead.
My name is Sophie Schnieders. I'm a sociology student. My question is that Putin has stated before, when he was asked about human rights violations in Russia, the idea that things are the same everywhere, that it's not better in any other country. But now there is a U.S. president who is making public statements in support of this idea, who, for example, when he was asked about the problems in Russia, said, oh, we're not so innocent. So do you think this gives more power to the Russian propaganda?
Thank you. And gentleman in the last.
One question concerning the root of the problem. Would you say that fake news only works that well due to the reason that, first of all, the people have lost their trust in the mass or in the mass media, specifically in the media which is given by the national governments? Second of all, is the speed within the information which is published on social networks relevant for the positive widespread of fake news? And third, how could an independent supranational agency, which is actually checking the correctness of news, help to not interfere into national sovereignty, but also to, first of all, give a critical and independent look of whether the information and data given is right?
Thank you. You didn't introduce yourself. Could you introduce yourself? Where are you from?
I'm intern
at
the European Parliament.
Let me take the Trump question. I mean, this is sort of a bit what I tried to talk a bit as well about, sort of people, some disenfranchised masses. And these are the sort of people who, I think to a large extent, voted for Trump. So it's not surprising in a sense that Trump endorses, can I say that, what Putin does actually, or what Putin says, because he's using many of the same tactics, especially when it comes to his tweets, and especially when it comes to when he tweets and how much he tweets. There usually comes sort of a barrage of tweets, 6 or 7, and then he sets the news agenda with that, because you have to report what the president tweets, basically, and we have to check that. And by that time, the things that actually was the news has moved away immediately to what Trump tweeted. This is how it works these days with Mr. Trump. So in a sense, Putin was emboldened with Mr. Trump because, in a sense, Mr. Trump has that sort of moral relativism that Mr. Putin has as well. That's sort of like, yes, we are bad as well. There is some sort of, we can clog the news system with different sort of things, and this happens. They are good, they are bad. They can both be good and bad at the same time. So in a sense that, he has taken the sort of Russian toolbox and applied it to the American public to a fantastic sort of success. So if Putin is happy about the thing Trump says about Russia, yeah, absolutely, because he's actually saying exactly what he wants to hear an American president say. It's about this sort of relativism. It's not about selling a specific propaganda or anything that, for example, communism or, that capitalism is bad or something like that. It's about saying that maybe there isn't such things as, morals or values, so that we have any special values. Maybe we're not better than the others. It's this sort of relativism that Putin wants to hear, and now he has another president saying exactly the same thing.
Shortly, for you points, first is it a problem of the media lacking confidence? Of course, I think that's one main reason. Other reasons are social media and these new possibilities for the Kremlin, for example, with PR agencies. Second, is the speed important point? Yes, it is, I think, very important. And third, an international agency which says what is true or not. I'm thinking about Orwell immediately when you say this, and I think this should not be possible. There could be some connection between technical solutions and solutions of which could implode freedom of speech. For example, if we have something which is under suspicion that it is fake news, that you program the algorithms so that the user becomes also another point of view automatically, and so he has 2 points of views and he can make his choice. And one word about Trump. Forgive me, but it's so for my soul. Because in Germany, I think Trump is a present from heaven or from the hackers for Putin. Because in Germany, many of the understanding for Putin, sympathies for Putin are out of anti-Americanism. And if many colleagues in Germany criticize me that I'm too critical towards Putin and you have to see the truth in the middle and you have to understand Putin, these are the same people who are writing about Trump as if he has invaded a neighbor country, as if he has shut down an airplane, and as if his opponents are killed. And so for Germany, I can say Trump is very, very helpful for Putin and for the sympathies Putin earns. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presentations, for exchange and explanation. Since disinformation and propaganda came to our societies for long, if not forever, I hope you will have enough motivation and patience to follow those issues and to approach us next time and time after the next in order to inform us in a best way. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, and that brings us to the third and last, but not least, of our sessions. My name is Morten Løkkegaard. I'm the third wheel on this car, also from the ALDE group. Very happy that so many of you made your way for this afternoon. I think it's the most needed and valuable debate and presentations that we have in order to kind of get to some policy making on this. And I guess from the first two sessions, we can all already draw some conclusion. I guess that it's much easier to come up with the description of the problem than come up with the solutions. I guess there's no golden egg here, and that's basically why we spend so much time discussing it and sort of getting closer to maybe to some solutions. Now, my friend Petras was joking about what our position is in the ALDE group. So I might just give you some clues on what I think our position is so far on this. I mean, it might not come as a surprise to any of you, but nevertheless, we liberals do not see strict legislation as the way forward, but we need to make sure that internet-based information platforms and news media accept some kind of responsibility. That's one of the key discussions that we have in our group. So the responsibility for the contents of their platform. So that's one area of responsibility. And then we also need to make sure that these internet-based information platforms and news media operate under the same rules and that regulate traditional media. That's also a big problem that we are constantly discussing. Maybe that had to include some kind of functional mechanism for self-regulation. And we haven't been talking a lot about that today, but we might get into that discussion in the next session here. And thirdly, we need to protect personal data much better. We need to set limits to how and how long data can be used. That's of course another discussion, but it's basically about the value of data and for how long we can use data and for what purpose. I think that's one of the structural things that we have to work very much also. We do that also in this House. And finally, and some of you have already touched upon this, we need to bring, of course, the educational question into this debate. The media literacy is of course still the theme. And now I have a fifth point also. We need to support public service media. Some of the speakers has also touched upon this, and I'm sure that we are going to get into this also in the last session. Now, as I just said, we need to go into some kind of solution mode, I guess, since we have spent some time describing the problems which is known to us so far. So I'm very happy that we have the two last speakers, and I already said to you that we could that we will bring the Commission to the platform in order to not to defend itself. It seems that we always end up in a situation where the Commission had to defend itself, but also to bring some light to what's actually going on at right this moment, because I know for a fact that something is going on over there. So I'm very happy that Prabhat Agrawal has seen the time to come here. Prabhat is works for the European Commission's DG Connect as Deputy Head of Units for e-commerce and online platforms. So we look forward in a minute to hear from you. But first we have a Danish professor, Mr. Vincent Hendricks. Mr. Hendricks is sort of a leading figure in the Danish debate about these issues. And just to give him some PR, he just came out with this book, Fake News, which is timely, since we are discussing this as a hot issue both in Denmark and in Brussels. So Mr. Hendricks is a professor of formal philosophy at the University of Copenhagen, but maybe more interesting today is the fact that he's the director of the Center for Information and Bubble Studies. He might use just two or three words to describe what these bubble studies are about, because this is key to this issue also. So let's move on. Mr. Hendricks, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come to this session here. I'm not changing my slides myself, so I'm going to have to give a word, so I have to change the slide now. Enough about the advertising. The book just came out in Danish. It's coming out in Spanish, English, and in German, so you don't have to take notes anytime soon. Now, once that is said, we are at the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. And so I thought I would take this with me as a starting point, and also, as Morten was indicating or alluding to, was the fact that we don't like to regulate markets. Now let's think about the information market for a second. And we know that market fundamentalism in the zeros had a problem. Alan Greenspan came out early and said, look, let's not regulate the market. It will be a self-organizing organism. The good papers, the good services and the good products, they're going to survive, and the rest is going to get weeded out by the efficiency of the market. So that's the efficient market hypothesis. And also the very same Greenspan came to realize that was not actually the case. There were a lot of products, financial products, that were not very good, but they could actually survive for quite some time. And one of the consequences we had of that was the subprime crisis. Now, it's a little bit about the same in the information market. That's not really as a regulated market as we know it either. And the point is sort of the same, that bad information can actually survive for some time, and they can actually have an influence. And the problem is basically there is no natural equilibrium in which the true information will survive and the bad information will sort of vanish. And the point is exactly the same. Again, the market for information is not an efficient market hypothesis. It's not efficient. And one way of getting out of that is, of course, to try to regulate it. But we should just realize this, that whatever is viral is not necessarily true, and whatever is true is not necessarily viral. So you don't get a natural equilibrium in which the good information will survive and the bad information will sort of vanish or diminish over time. At least not so far as we know. Because, of course, this is still early days, and we don't have that much experience with exactly how long bad information can actually stay in the market. But so far, it's been going pretty well, even under the assumption that everybody got aware of this fake news business, which is, by the way, not news. There were fake news back in 1835 when the penny press thought that there were lunar monsters who were actually having a promiscuous life, and they sold a lot of papers. It wasn't true, but it's been around for quite some time. And this is just to say that the market for information is not efficient. And when we are talking about regulating or coming up with solutions, we should at least acknowledge this fact that it is not an efficient market as far as we know for now. Now, one thing we should also realize, and what sort of asset is interesting online? And that basically is sort of the same question as when we were talking about bubbles. There are assets that you could overheat. And there are also assets that you can overheat on the information market. And the prime asset on the information market is attention. Attention is the number one asset. And why? Because attention is traffic, and traffic is money, power, influence, etc. But you should also realize one thing about attention, namely, attention is not normally distributed as on your left, such that the bulk of us can sort of allocate the same amount of attention in others. It doesn't work like that. Attention online does not follow a normal distribution like height or weight. It's a power distribution as the one that you have on your right. That means that a few actors are basically walking away with most of the attention, and then the rest of the actors will have to fight for whatever is left out in the tail. Macroscopically, that's the case. So 95% of all traffic on the web is among 5 actors, pretty much, as Professor Luther was alluding to, namely Facebook, YouTube, Google, Instagram, and a few others. They're basically walking away with almost all the traffic. It's a little bit like Tom Piketty's The Capital, yes? 1% own 50%, and then 99% have to get whatever is left when the big ones are taking at the table. It's the same thing with the information or attention. Attention is really not normally distributed in any obvious way. And of course, you can speculate in this. And it turns out also to be the case that the ones who are big tend to get even bigger. I don't know if you know, but the person in the world with the most followers on social media is not Donald Trump, it's not Barack Obama, it's not Angela Merkel, it's Taylor Swift. She has 264 million followers on Facebook, on Instagram, YouTube, and the rest. And then on the first 5 places, you have Taylor Swift, Cristiano Ronaldo, Selena Gomez, ending up with Rihanna. Rihanna has 150 million followers on social media. Now, on the first 5 places, you drop 100 million followers. So there's your power distribution for you right there. That also goes for political capital, or it also goes to political actors. So if you look at the ones during the American election who had by far the most, and I mean by far the most attention, is Donald J. Trump. And even CBS director came out and said, it's not good for America, but it's good for CBS. And the reason is that there's a lot of money to be made in these sorts of things. So it's basically to say that both macroscopically, that in terms of who actually gets most of the traffic, and microscopically, it's also the case that it's very unevenly distributed. Now, why is this interesting? Well, this has actually been prophetically looked at back in 1971. Nobel Prize laureate Herbert Simon already said it back then. He said, in an information-rich world, the wealth of information means the dearth of something else. A scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. Now, what information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attentions of its recipients. So there is a very interesting synergy effect between attention on one hand and information on the other. Because while I'm actually attending to information, my attention is being grabbed. Yes? So then you might just speculate in what sort of information people would want to listen to or read or write or share or like. And then again, as I was saying in the beginning, whatever is true is not necessarily viral, and whatever is viral is not necessarily true. So that basically means that you can speculate in what sort of information that people will consume, and you grab their attention. And while you're at it, realize one thing. See, the social media platform have a very, very good business model. And it's very simple. You allocate people's attention using information. Now, consumption of information generates traffic. And then traffic is money, power, influence, and advertising. And every user think that they are sort of a customer. And then they have a profile. They're sort of the customers. They're the users, at least. But we know that if you don't pay for it, you're not the customer. You're the product. And so every user generates information, and that information is being allocated in somebody else. And then what Facebook and YouTube and the rest are doing is that they're selling that attention to the advertisers. They're the ones paying for it. So basically every user online is a product that's being sold. And it's very hard to compete with 2 billion products. I don't know of any outlet that has 2 billion products online. They do. So we should just realize this, that there is a very particular model that means that allocating people's attention is prime asset, because attention is basically what you sell to the advertisers. Now, the advertisers usually don't care much where they advertise, but sometimes they do. There was a case in which there was a live stream of a suicide, and Pepsi-Cola didn't want to advertise there. So there might be something thinking about exactly how the big players in the field, whether or not they are corporately socially responsible, and whether or not an institution like the European Parliament could actually maybe, if not call up these people, but at least make them aware that whenever they're advertising is basically subsuming the business of these players, and if they have corporate social responsibility being more than just a footnote on page 50 in the annual report, maybe they're actually going to mean something to them. So that's one thing one could speculate in. Another thing one should be aware of is this whole business of fake news invasion. I'll stick to the fake news and as a term. I completely understand that there would be good reasons for not doing it. But let's see if we can define these concepts, if we could, a little more closely. We developed an information quality scale where we, at least, I'm a logician and a mathematician, so that's easy. Doing it in practice is harder, but I'll leave that to the practitioners. However, at least you can say that we can make distinctions between true statements, those are the verified facts. Those are the ones that you'll find in Zone 1. Then you have doctored statements. Those are the ones that are either framed or cherry-picked or in some other ways doctored, or you leave out certain facts and you emphasize certain other facts. Then you've got undocumented statements. Those are the ones that are rumors that could be true, maybe false. And then you have Zone 3. Those are the lies. They are intended to contradict the facts. So you acknowledge as a liar that there is something called true. That's very different from Harry Frankfurt's bullshit, excuse my French, which is an academic term, I should note, where BS, according to Harry Frankfurt, is where you basically dilute the distinction between truth and falsity. And that's in a certain sense more what fake news is all about. Because fake news, when it works and when it's properly organized, and it might actually take some time to do it, and there's a reason why, because you have to simulate reality. It's not the reality, but you'll simulate as if it were. And that might be good enough, especially because fake news is not usually just false. There's too much sunk cost in propelling out a falsehood. It's in part true and in part false. And so the way in which you do it is that you try to get people at least some facts to hang their hat on, and then bias and polarization will take care of converting your uncertainty about something to certainty about maybe there's something to it. Or using belief echoes that even if it gets debunked, it's still out there on the web, and then you can still use it, right? So you can always return to it. And then there is a very good point of one of my other colleagues up here saying, truth is hard to check. It takes a lot of time. That's one of the big challenges we do have. Producing fake news, sometimes it's easy and sometimes takes a little longer. But I'm just saying that we are always running behind. From that perspective, there's no difference between being a journalist and being a scientist. It's the same sort of thing. Checking up the facts is hard work. Producing a working hypothesis is usually easy, at least if it's not dumb. So there is a very, very uneven balance between, yet on one hand saying, look, we want to get truthful information, and yet on the other saying we've got to have to check it at the same time, because the labor intensity of the two things is very, very different. So what is interesting about the fake news is that it simulates journalism and it simulates truthfulness. And that makes it a very, very hard competitor to play with. Now, the question is, of course, why does it work? Now, of course, we've heard about rustling, meddling, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, there's definitely something to it. But last year, Johan Benkler and his company at MIT did a very interesting survey. And I took one of their slides with me here. And what they were able to demonstrate is that a closed ecosystem of alt-right media, particularly they were analyzing both Facebook shares and Twitter data, that a closed ecosystem consisting of notably Breitbart News, Go and Defay, Gateway Pundits, and a few others, and then to some degree also Fox News, were able to create a closed ecosystem which were able to actually address exactly the concerns of the Trumpian electorate. But they did it in such a noisy way, using framing, cherry-picking, fake news, and the other information qualities I was showing you before, in such a way that they made so much noise that if the mainstream media did not take him up, they were going to lose attention. So they were actually fishing for the fools, as Akerlof and Schiller would have it. Namely, if CNN didn't take up these fake news stories and put it in and started discussing it, somebody else would. And then MSNBC would get that particular bunk of the attention. So basically, it was a genius strategy. And why? You talked exactly to the ones you wanted to talk to. And while you were doing it, you did it in such a noisy way that the mainstream media had to pick it up. Now, what do you get out of that? Political agenda setting across the board, independently of whether it's true or false, independently of whether they want to or not, independently of whether it's for or against. And that makes for a very, very, very strong signal to send out to the public. And that's basically what fake news can do for you if it works right. It's agenda setting. And maybe, as Morten was also alluding to before, not that the European Parliament should start using the same sort of strategy, because I think that would be bad, but maybe it's also time to set the agenda in a different sort of way. And you've got players out there who want to play with you. I was recently at the OECD. They have the same sort of issue. World Economic Forum back in 13, 14, 15s, and 16s has said, now 17, that misinformation on the web is a global challenge. And why? Because it threatens global governance. So there's another player. So you have some very strong alliances with other big institutions around the world that it sort of has the same sort of issue. That brings me to my last point, which concerns what to do about it. Now, at least I think we should acknowledge the fact that if we just understand the information market to be a self-regulating organism, I think we misunderstood the entire point of how it works, at least for now. So from that perspective, there might be something to regulating the market. Now, that's a difficult job to do, and you don't want to interfere with freedom of speech, et cetera, but there are things you could do. Look, Google and Facebook and YouTube are so big now, they can do exactly the same as BBC, ABC, CBS, NBC, and all of them put together. Why isn't it about time to say, look, if you can live stream, if you have 2 billion journalists writing for you, getting rid of their copyright as soon as they post it, maybe it's time for you to say, look, now you have media responsibility laws, you have good excellence in journalism principles, all those are going to kick in for you. And they're going to ask you, well, how should we administer that? And you're going to say, that's your problem, but we're going to check that you do. Just to say, if you're that big, why should established journalists have worse conditions than the desperados? That's exactly the situation that's in now. So maybe there is an issue there at least to be thought about whether or not there would be something to the fact of saying your media outlets on the same part of BBC, CBS, NBC, New York Times, whoever, now the same laws apply to you and your journalist. How you want to administer it, that's not our problem. You just have to do it. So that's at least one thing you can think about. Then there's the whole issue of education, of educating people, like digital education. I agree that is something, but it has to start when people are born, because they get their iPad when they're 1. Just to say it has to start earlier. And we are also developing some tools in that respect. But it has to be such. Couldn't you imagine if you are a 9th grader, you should be able to design the perfect shitstorm and demount it, knowing something about information quality and proliferation, what sort of terms work and do not work. Jonah Berger, who was a marketing expert from Morten, has shown that if you can feed into people's fear, anger, and indignation, negative activity, mobility sentiments, then you got yourself a game for proliferation of information, independently of whether it's true or not. True is, again, not necessarily viable. So that's one thing. And so basically they should be able to find it and look at it on their own merits and with their own examples. And then there's a final thing that I just came across recently, namely just throwing facts at people is not going to change their minds usually. It just doesn't happen like that, because either you're going to consider it fake news, or you're going to consider it, you're going to use cognitive dissonance and get rid of it or ignore it in some other way. But there is a third concept that's being investigated right now. It's called scientific curiosity. It's not that you have to take a stance. You're just interested in getting an idea of how was this working hypothesis worked out. And because curiosity is not biased, it's not a biased attitude towards inquiry. Getting information in order for you to make a decision is. So there might be something to actually stimulate work in scientific curiosity and stimulate people to be curious rather than being judgmental. And curiosity might be a way to go. But that's fairly new research. I know very little about it. And on that note, I think I'll follow Forrest Gump in saying that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I'm sure we have a whole chunk of questions for you, at least I have, but please do, as an audience, come back to us. But before that, Mr. Agarwal, I think we need to hear something about what you do in the Commission, huh?
Thank you. So I'm going to start by telling Julia, actually, please don't use my slides. And so just you can leave this slide up, but I prepared them this morning. I had no idea what the panel would be discussing, and in fact, I need to tell a totally different story, and I think that I don't want to appear tone deaf. If you look at my slides, you get the feeling that I would be speaking to a different audience and a different mindset. So let me just say a few words about what we do, and some key colleagues are in the room, and some others maybe on the live stream. So I'm Pravat, and I work at DG Connect, and I'm one of the people working on the regulatory and policy framework for online platforms, for the large online platforms. And many of the things that have been discussed here today have already are following within my remit of the work that we do. But we're not doing this alone, and particularly the work on post-truth, on fake news, is done with a lot of colleagues, who are some of which are actually in the room. There's Annie and there's Adam also from DG Connect, and we're working intensively from the beginning. We've been working together with colleagues across the Commission in the Joint Research Center. There's a team who's looking at targeted messaging, like Cambridge Analytica. There is, of course, the eStratCom team that has been mentioned in the previous panel, and DGCom, who is our external communication arm, are also involved. So now this is who's working on it, but you want to know what we're working on. So let me just start before I go into this. With two pieces of political framing, because there are two things that you need to know about the Commission's response. One is that in a parliamentary debate earlier this year, in April 2017, Vice President Ansip intervened on this matter in plenary, and I just wanted, the key takeaway of his message was that fake news is really bad, but a ministry of truth is even worse. And this has been our guiding line in the developing of the policies so far. And it's a simple statement, but I think it powerfully conveys some of the balances and some of the complexity of things that we have to address. The second thing that was also mentioned in the previous panel, and this is a relatively recent thing, is that in the mission letter of the new Digital Commissioner, Maria Gabriel, the President has indeed asked her to look at the implications of fake news and the policy responses that are needed on this. So this is the Commission is doing something. It may not be always very visible, and it may not also be as forceful and as bold as some of the speakers earlier might have wished. But let me explain a little bit. In my presentation will be in 5 different parts. So I'll first share a little bit what our internal problem analysis is so far. And part of the reason why I'm really happy that we're here is that, of course, this is before we start talking about solutions. we need to understand what problems we're tackling. And in an area like fake news and in junk news, or what you want to call, the difficulty is, of course, that these are heterogeneous and heterogeneous sets of problems that don't easily are categorized. This is not a simple one-dimensional thing. There are a lot of things that have been revealed very recently from the computational propaganda project, which we've studied very carefully, from the kind of research about filter bubbles and about confirmation bias, which is just emerging. And I think there's not a day when I don't receive some kind of academic report about information propagation online and how it's different or how it's not different in any other way. So this is a fast-moving, quickly emerging, highly technical problem. Is exactly the kind of stuff that the Commission is really great at tackling. Yeah? So, so with our team, we're looking at our problem analysis, and so far we kind of wanted to just untie the knots a little bit and untangle the strands a little bit, and we kind of internally are making distinctions between clickbait kind of problems that have been mentioned before here as well, social bots like the ones that have been studied in the computational propaganda project, but also we're very carefully looking at the use of satire and willful. This is not a category that you mentioned, Vincent, just previous, but the whole thing about information that is satirical or ironical, which we know is very difficult to track, for example, with artificial intelligence approaches. Wrong information which is not willfully wrong, but it's just wrong. For example, scientific research is wrong initially before it's right. Some people do investigative journalism and they get it wrong. This is something that David Kay mentioned in his intervention earlier. And then, of course, there are the two categories that have been discussed, disinformation and propaganda. And we are also concerned about information warfare, just to give you the sense that we're not taking this lightly. We're not naive about these problems. We're not saying that these problems don't exist, but we believe that they need a careful and very, very thorough and neutral and probably cold-headed analysis before we move to so we're squarely in the place where we are analyzing these problems and we're collecting information and collecting insights into this. And one of the things that this was mentioned by David Kay is also one of the questions that we are asking, or at least I'm asking myself, is that what is the specific harm of these categories, and not just knowing that this is going on. What's the scale of this problem? But and there's data emerging about the scale of the problem. There's of the prevalence of the problem and who's affected by it. But I think, at least I'm aware of relatively limited knowledge about specific harms, except for in some of the categories that were mentioned in the previous things. So this problem analysis is of course not complete, and it's a fast evolving thing. But this is just to give you an idea of some of the things that we're internally discussing. I'd be very happy to hear whether there, and I've already picked up some of the things where there are elements missing. I've already noted about the attention economy, and we'll come to that later. So that's the first part. Second thing is that we need to be very clear about what boundaries we are operating in, and I think this is a very important second part. So because it's a complicated problem and a complex problem as well, and because there are boundaries that state control and regulation should not typically overstep, because this is about media regulation, we need to step very carefully. So we need to be clear about where the boundaries lie of where we're moving. So one is, of course, freedom of expression. This was mentioned earlier. And this comes back to the Ministry of Truth. We don't want a state institution to be the arbiter of truth in any of these things. So when we speak about post-truth or fake news, who should decide if something is fake or not? This needs to be done at least at arm's length, if not more, if not further away. So this is one of the boundaries that we're working on. Media pluralism is another really important one. The danger of a single story is also very important. The opposite of post-truth can't be a single truth established by a personal thing. I take the point from the previous panel about willful information warfare being in a different category, but in many of the other categories are not so easily circumscribed by a single voice. And the third boundary that I want to say, when I mentioned this, is also the subject of a lot of debate in the Parliament today and also in the Commission, is around illegal content. So in the European Union, there are some categories of content that are illegal. Child sexual abuse material, incitement to terrorism since the Terrorism Directive, illegal hate speech, which is defined in a framework decision of the Council, and a category and a range of IPR infringements. They are illegal if they are unlicensed in the case of IPR, they're illegal online. And so fake news and the junk news phenomenon that we're speaking about, they are not per se illegal. There may be some overlaps with defamation and defamation laws, but this is a very important distinction. So the legal basis, and this comes back to the question of whether regulation is the right answer or not. And this may sound like a bit of a legalistic thing, but the legal basis for us to intervene is very different when we have illegal content like child sexual abuse material, and we want to moderate that online, and this also proliferates I take a really important point away from this mention is that something that Lisa said right at the beginning is that much of this is going on in closed groups. This is not open, and this is not accessible to stuff, and this is also true for some of the illegal content. So the boundaries that the fourth boundary that I just want to mention is data protection, and as you know, European Union places a very high value on data protection and higher than many other reasons. And some of the elements that were involved in attention merchandising are related to use of personal data, and we need to make sure that no boundaries being crossed, that consent is given when your personal data is being used. You know, some of the training work that was going on in MTurk, which was a training model for the Cambridge Analytica profiling work, was arguably given with consent by people who filled out a personality tests. But I'm not sure whether this is really something that you and I would consider informed consent, you know, because did you know that you're going to be profiled afterwards? I'm not totally sure. So these are some boundaries. I'm sure they're not complete. So freedom of expression, media pluralism, illegal content, and on one side, and legal content on the other side, data protection as the last one. So this was my second part. I'll have three more parts. One is on pitfalls now, one is on inroads, and then a little bit on solution space, because this is what, Morten, you wanted to know. And the last one on the solution space, I'll put a big disclaimer that these are my own ideas and they don't at all represent the Commission's view in any way. This is actually true for the entire intervention. I don't know why I say this for the end. You know, okay. But on the pitfalls, what are the pitfalls that we've kind of come across and identified? You know, one is offline versus online. You know, in what ways? And this was also mentioned by one of the speakers earlier. You know, it's true, of course, that certain things go faster. Attention is much more of a commodity online than it is offline. You know, but it's also the question is this a matter of qualitative or quantitative difference? You know, because of course headlines are grabbing when you want to go past a news agent. They're grabbing your attention too at the headline. You know, and these headlines are not always right. And you know, they grab you and they lead. And when you read the article, it doesn't at all say what it says on the box, you know, right? And we even use that expression in English, you know, it doesn't say it doesn't do what it says on the package, right? And that's because you've been misled into buying something and so on. So clickbait also exists in the offline world, you know, so that's something where we are asking. So one of the things is what's the difference between offline and online? And we know that tabloid media is very good at propagating false information, and and self-regulation has been so far and continues to be the right approach to that kind of thing. The second one is really important, and this may be different or may not be different, I don't know, is confirmation bias. And this is something that was said earlier. The inability to change people's opinions when you expose them with facts is really striking. And I think that this is something that I personally am only appreciating recently, and I think many people in the Commission have been working on the assumptions that if you provide people with facts and there are truthful statements, you know, they will change their opinion. But actually, we're just learning now in the last in the last months, I would say, although this has been known, as you say, from the work on information markets for a long time in certain enlightened communities. But the inability that to change people's opinion when confronted with facts is really something that is a relatively new insight for many policymakers. And I think we see it from the vaccination problems all the way through European Union policies and so on. That's the second pitfall that I think that I just want to stress. And the third pitfall is overregulation. And so it's very easy to get this wrong because this is a fine-grained, fast-moving area which is traditionally where the traditionally state intervention should be extremely limited and viewed with suspicion. And so what is a proportionate, effective and efficient intervention to address this space of complex problems? This is not at all clear, but it's certainly a pitfall to go and say regulation will solve this. And this links a little bit to a concept which I just want to mention, which comes up in my conversations a lot, which is the magic regulator. The regulator has magic powers we just need to give them to them, and they're just going to fix this problem of fake news. And I think this is an illusion that we need to kind of come away from. I actually think the Commission is a great place to work, and I love working for the Commission, and I defend it at every instant. But we should not imagine that there is something like a magic regulator which can just wave the wand and this problem will go away. And I think this then leads me to the last two things: the inroads, the approaches that we could take, and some of the solution spaces. Again, I just want to stress the disclaimer that these are my personal thoughts. So one inroad is, of course, digital literacy. That has been mentioned. But I think we all agree that digital literacy is really an important part of the mix. But I also think that we need to be careful not to put everything in the box of digital media literacy. It can't solve all of the problems that are there. And maybe one thing that one can think about is actually to determine what is actually the state of digital media literacy at the moment before we determine that changes are needed to it in terms of funding and so on. So sometimes I think that we all agree that critical thinking is the kind of vaccination. I'll come back to that in the end. The way that you vaccinate society against fake news or junk news or misinformation is by educating them with skills of critical thinking. This is the true long-term survival strategy, sustainable survival strategy, and the kind of experiments with youngsters that you're describing, they're just basically training methods of vaccinating people against or curiosity-driven scientific inquiries with equipping them with critical. I think that sometimes I think that a system like the PISA monitoring for basic skills that the OECD is conducting on math and science skills or reading skills, that could be extended to critical thinking. Measuring how many of the OECD countries have critical thinking skills at the age of 15 is going to provide a baseline from which we can work. At the moment, I think we have all sorts of assumptions. I say that because I have a teenage daughter and my wife is a teacher, is that we have all sorts of assumptions about what youngsters can and cannot determine as being real or not. And I think that kind of my reality checks with them, they don't always work. I think youngsters are at once much cleverer than we believe they are at debunking things, and also more naive in a way. So it's a different skill set, and I think that we policymakers tend to be not on Facebook and not on Twitter and be outside of these information bubbles, and they're maybe not the best place to identify the dynamics that they're trying to influence. So that's one thing on digital literacy. Second thing is I totally agree with what some of the speakers in the previous panel said. He said we need better monitoring. And so just actually knowing what's going on is really, and this is something I really applaud kind of the efforts of the Computational Propaganda Project, because I think this is the kind of project that needs to be just knowing what's going on. We've also been trying to look at the efforts that's been at automatic bot detection, and but we understand that it's not so easy to automatically determine that whether something is a bot or not. It's easy for us to say, we should label bots, but disclosure in mandatory labeling of bots. But I'm not actually sure. When I look at the research, the efficiency of bot detection is very low at the moment, and then the strategies seem so obvious to circumvent the detection mechanisms, so that I don't actually think that mandatory labeling is necessarily a panacea for social bots. But that's, maybe I'm just not right on that. But monitoring in general about what the scale of this problem is in high quality monitoring is very through some kind of observatory functions. Third inroad. I'm just going to speed up a bit because supply of high quality information, that was already mentioned also by David Kay, and then the corporate social responsibility that you mentioned before. I think that's a really powerful thing, and actually the Commission has already published guidance on corporate social responsibility, and one of the things that I think we could do is review whether this is really happening to the way that we had intended it was happening, and I think that's a really very good way, and I'll just underline it twice here. 3 things have been announced last week by Commissioner Gabriel and covered in the media. Is a kind of setting up of an expert group and a process to seek views of people. This is part of a kind of fact-finding thing. Also something that I want to mention is that we're running a couple of projects on algorithmic transparency and information shaping through algorithms, and they'll start this year still, and some of them have been sponsored by the Parliament. So those are going to be important vehicles for us to understand and also communicate a little bit what we can say. So finally, just what to putting all this together, what does the solution space look like? I don't know. And I think this is an important conversation that we need to have together with the Parliament, and I think this is a very important thing. I don't at all see this as something the Commission does its thing and then we later on come to. I think events like this, and this is not the first one on fake news, and I'm sure it's not the last one either. They're very important to create partnerships and collaborations that we align the kind of work also with academics and NGOs and civil society, so that we kind of take a kind of multi-stakeholder approach. I know the word is not so popular, to go to progressing in this, But so better measurement on literacy but also on the scale of disinformation out there. One part of the solution space got to be data sharing of the large platforms, data sharing and about how they use information themselves and giving access to researchers at least to the kind of data that allows us to understand how the information dynamics works, and so this is a really important part, so that we can actually work on the solution space together. Okay, I already mentioned increasing the supply of quality information, and I'll just close with the statement I already made, is that ultimately I think, this is my personal view, the vaccination of society is going to come through education. And this is not something where the Commission has competence in any way, but is, I think, in a way, the single highest return on investment. As a society as such, we need to vaccinate, we need to immunize ourselves against the kind of things, and that comes through kind of educating and equipping people with critical thinking skills and critical argument skills. And I think this is maybe the single most important challenge for the next decade. So I'll close with that.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, for not taking the slides that you have introduced. You have with you, because this is too late in the day to actually have too many overlaps. But thank you for a snap and quick and efficient presentation. Now we are left with sort of 10 minutes now, and I think we have many things on the table from these two gentlemen. So let's just start the questioning round immediately. This gentleman.
Hello, my name is David Iovanescu. I'm from Romania. I'm an intern. I have a thing to say. There is a saying, you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. So my question is, what do you think of the idea to focus our efforts and resources to raise awareness and teach critical thinking in our younger generation in order for them to raise awareness in their families, relatives, because usually the problem is with older people, from what I noticed. They're the ones spreading.
Define older people.
And my second question is, do you think we can use influential personalities like celebrities to raise awareness in a moral way?
Like Melania Trump, you mean?
Like what?
Like Melania Trump?
No.
Well, I mean, that's her agenda. May I?
Yeah, but there was the two questions, I assume? Yeah, right. Vincent, you are.
Well, I mean, I don't think Melania Trump is a good example of one that should be for cyberbullying, just to say. But teaching an old dog new tricks. Look, I think we are all part of this big social technical experiment called being part of the information age. And I think everybody has to chip in, large or small, teacher or student, a lot. And the reason is that between the two generations, that's probably where you find the synergy effect of exactly teaching critical thinking in a way the next generation can take ownership, while the older generation might have a better idea of exactly what kind of values that we sort of enforce. And while we're at it, now, I totally give you pride here that it's extremely important to get us, young or old, to understand the dynamics that we are living in and the structure of it. And there is a reason for it. So, for instance, we did a big survey on cyberbullying. And it turns out that pluralistic ignorance, that means majority mistakes, is a very prevalent figure. Namely, that young people 15 don't think it's cool to cyberbully themselves, but they wrongfully believe that their peers, and particularly their friends, are much more positively inclined towards it than they are themselves. And then you get the problem of which you actually get individuals who collectively subscribe to a norm that they privately reject. Now, how do you get rid of that? That's like risk behavior. Now, you can tell people don't cyberbully or don't drink when they're 15. And I have teenage kids. It doesn't work like that. But what actually has turned out to be proven to work since the 1990s, is actually to teach the next generation the structure and the dynamics of exactly something like majority mistake or pluralistic ignorance. That in and by itself can have a preventive measure. And that actually supports Bradhar's idea, namely teach critical thinking, but teach the structure and the dynamics of the social psychological phenomenon that in some part is part of the problem.
But just to follow up on that, I'll come back to you, sir. But I was a little fascinated, Vincent, by the example you gave when you say you have to educate people from when they're born, and you talk about the 9th grade creating the perfect shitstorm. Do you mean that?
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about, to have this kind of level?
I mean, look, this is my personal idiosyncratic opinion, and I'm not in educational studies, but yes, I tend to think so. I tend to think that if you understand how shitstorms do work in terms of structure and the dynamics, then it might also be easy to see through it. It's not that you can do it every time, but at least you know what sort of ingredient feeds into it. And those ingredients in by itself, some of them you might be able to detect, and you might be saying, well, this person is being harassed, and there's absolutely no reason for it, and I can understand the structure by which it happened. And people are chipping in different ways. So yes, I actually do believe that.
Okay, Prabhat, would you address this, or just briefly now?
Yeah, just 2 points. I mean, I think that one of the things is that the behavioral nudges that lead to change are very important to understand, and I'm sure that having young kids teaching older generations is an important thing in that. I think there's also research that supports this. You know, for example, there's NBER research, National Bureau of Economic Research, that shows that actually the most polarized voters in the Trump elections were those who were disconnected from social media, right? So it's not like there is a one-to-one relation there. So that does exist. But I think that I'm a little bit worried about this a too simple binary between young and old, people who get it and people who don't get it. You know, maybe that's true. But I think that's too simplistic. That leads us down to very, very easy solutions, which I think are not necessarily wrong. I think what we need to do is just to work on understanding which behavioral nudges and what the dynamics are that affect the change. And I think young people and old people both play a big role in this. That's all I want to say.
Okay, this gentleman out there.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a story that came out about 3 months ago. There was a leak from The Guardian that basically leaked the rules by which Facebook ranks, removes certain types of content. So whether that's illegal content, whether that's fake content, whether that's cyberbullying content. You may not also know, but Google has a team called LeapForce, which is a sort of third-party institution that has about 3,000 raters that's ranking your search results. Now, the fact that that is a private thing and it affects 2 billion people, where you don't know the rules by which your content is being filtered. I think that's something that relates to your point about the sort of algorithmic transparency. Is I think that one solution is to actually open up competition for different types of ranking methods and ranking systems. I don't think it would actually harm the platforms. I think it would just encourage competition. For example, thinking about ranking systems which could actually rank up quality or different measures of credibility or entertainment, and actually opening that up for people to actually see, how their content is being ranked, or make a choice on what they wanted.
Just for me to understand, this opening up, should that be a legislative initiative or?
Opening up how knowledge about how the rules by which your content is ranked on your newsfeed or in your search engine or in your ad network, and given that it affects so many people, making that a public right.
Okay, Prabhat.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before, and so this is let me just, I don't think that we're quite ready to say we need to kind of, there's a competition measure that needs to be done across the board. I mean, the way that the Commission has approached the specifics of the Google case are a very detailed analysis of one particular case, and you should read the hundreds and hundreds of pages of analysis that go into it. It's a very well substantiated and argued case on a particular example, ex post, and so on. So from there to jump to the conclusion that we need across the board kind of disclose algorithms. We're not. That's not on the agenda at the moment. I think what is on the agenda, and I think this is part of the project that we're commissioning, is that what is effective transparency in this space? And I think effective transparency is not total disclosure. And that's a really important thing to know. I mean, and the example that I always give, and this doesn't come from me, it comes from Dana Boyd, is the Heartbleed bug, which is an open source SSL bug, which was lying around for years, and nobody saw it, and it was open source, and nobody spotted it, and it became one of the biggest cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So full disclosure doesn't necessarily lead to effective transparency. It's something else. What that means exactly, I think we need to have a conversation and a process to determine that. But I think that transparency is an important part of the question. How exactly it is designed, I'm not sure.
Can I have a follow-up question there? Because what I realized already in January when we had a conference here in the same room, very same room with Facebook represented, was that you guys in the Commission already for some time had a dialogue, let's call it a critical dialogue, with both Facebook, Google, and the rest of the big ones about these things. Could you be a little more specific on these conversations, this dialogue? What does it lead to? Because something is going on between you and the five bigs.
So that sounds more mysterious than it is, you know. And I mean, there are a number of voluntary dialogues that are going on between, these are between the Commission and not only in the Commission and the online platforms, and they're basically ways of framing the self-regulatory efforts that are going on, right? And so what we don't want is self-regulation to be simply an excuse for a deregulatory agenda, so just leave us alone. That's not. I don't think that's kind of within the mandate. We want self-regulation to produce results, and we want to make sure that it has a kind of that they have KPIs and that they have targets and that they are kind of accountable to at least the citizen, what is being produced. So a number of such dialogues are going on, and the ones that are most best known are the ones on illegal hate speech, which is being carried out by the colleagues in DG Just. There's one on terrorism content, which is done through the EU Internet Forum and together with Europol on terrorism content. And there are some others. It is on counterfeit goods, on selling counterfeit goods on online platforms, and so on and so forth. And so in this framework, we've also had conversations with the big platforms around their efforts around fake news. But I think that it's not at this point. These are just conversations where we've been asking, what are you doing? How are you measuring progress? How are you sure that? Are you sure this is working? We are concerned about this, and I think this is not a secret. I mean, this is not something also surprising. Of course, we would ask them, what exactly are you doing? This is a part of our ongoing. And I have to say, also to the credit of the platforms, I think they've been very proactive in answering our questions, and they've been collaborative. It's not. I don't think we should come away with the opinion that they have been obstructive in any way or unconstructive. That's whether that matches whether the ambition of what's going on matches our ambitions or the ones of the European Parliament. This is a second question, and that might need to evolve.
Well, let's see. But a little piece of advice from us over here could maybe to be a little more transparent, I should say, about this dialogue, because I think that although you seem to think that many people know that this is not a secret, well, for many people it is actually a secret, because when I tell people that we actually have this conversation, people don't know. So I think we could brag a little bit about this. I think that would be preferable. Vincent, just a follow-up question also in this regard concerning the five bigs. I know that you and I had some debates also in our home country about what to do with them. And it seems to me that you're a little bit now moving to a place where you're kind of accepting that these guys have some responsibility and we have to give them some push in order to get there.
Well, I think they've had responsibility all along. I mean, if the number one asset is information and attention, then they're sitting with it. You can forget about cluster bombs. But if you look, go to. I don't know if people who have a Facebook profile, if they ever went and looked at the community standards, you have to click through them, and then you have to, and then people click through them, but they never look at them. But if you look at them, they're actually pretty strict as to what you can and cannot do. Of course, it's probably pretty hard to enforce it, but there's a lot of things that you actually can do. Now, those are editorial standards by Facebook, right? Those are their editorial standards. And of course, they're having 2 million products that they're juggling every day, so it's going to be pretty hard to just to figure it out. But it does point to one thing, namely, it seems as if they want to be corporately, socially responsible, right? I mean, it's actually there in their community standards. So maybe from that perspective, I think it's about time to say, look, put your money where your mouth is, and we'll help you. And we are legitimate, and we are a legitimate European institution with the entire population of the European Union behind us. So you want to play?
That could be the final remark. We're just past 6 o'clock, so I think it's about closing time now. Thank you very much for coming, all of you. A big round of applause for these two gentlemen, I guess, would be appropriate.
I wanted to buy it.
No, you can have it.
Fortunately enough, I don't have to conclude anything on these discussions today, but I think we got a lot of inspiration. I think we got good presentations, and I think also we got very good questions from you, the audience. We'll get back to this. You'll hear more from the ALDE group on this. Thank you very much for attending.